You. Only you.
You, actually. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Big Boys Table, Episode 11. A, I, and You. Featuring Nekron. And me. And Mesk. Hi.
Hi.
Hello. Oh, whoa, what's this?
Alright. So, basically, the whole idea here of this episode is to explain in an educational fashion the uses of AI, why they're important to video games, and basically why they are like, especially if you're not interacting with a set of puzzles or something, a set of assignments, why they are basically really foundational building blocks for how games are constructed and how they are to be played. So Mesk here is going to start us off with some layman's examples of what AI actually is and how it works.
So, I'm sure everybody here is familiar with games like Smash Brothers Brawl or Blaze Blue. The former perhaps because of its legend of body odor, and the latest because the company made Dragon Ball Fighter Z. So, in a typical fighting game, you're playing against an opponent. Maybe that opponent is your roommate. Maybe that opponent is your wife's boyfriend. Whatever the case is, there's, generally speaking, in a multiplayer environment, an opponent that you are playing against that is thinking. If you're around the same skill level, say around like an intermediate skill level, say you've both played for a while, you're going to be trying to outwit each other. You both have kind of an idea of what kind of characters you each play, why you play them, the sort of, move sets you favor, the things you may be weak at, etc. And you're probably both going to be trying to play around that. So take Ricky Honajase, for example. He's a Frenchman. He plays largely Hakumen because he's not really that great at making combos. He plays very poke-styled, and he's actually made people rage quit from streamed tournaments before. So that's a play style of Ricky. Now, think about single player. Now, fighting game single player is usually categorized into two different things. It's either an opponent that is incredibly easy and you can cheese, or it's an opponent that reads everything you do and always has the perfect response. So it's like, if you use heavy attacks, the AI will always run up and poke you, stuff like that. So, but most games these days don't actually feature AI at all. The quote-unquote AI they feature is a series of timers, like, for example, everything within Diablo 3, within World of Warcraft, stuff like that. It's effects or RNG tied to timers. And yeah, so you don't usually really typically think of AI as an engaging thing. But when you think about it, for example, in a single player project, AI is actually pretty significant because a lot of things can be categorized in AI from, how units are sent at you to how things attack to you, harassment, stuff like that. All that stuff everyone is actually probably in large part very familiar with, at least at a conceptual level. But when you think about a fighting game, what if you had an AI that actually had personality to it, that sort of replicated your roommate or your wife's boyfriend? Your wife's boyfriend who is very, very nice to buy a Wii for you. He actually plays very, very defensively. He's very insecure, and he'll only become aggressive if he manages to get you on your back foot, so to say. If he manages to counterattack your aggression, and then he suddenly has an explosion of aggression himself, like he did when he stole your wife. Very, very simple stuff that you can do with an AI. So, what is AI? What is computer AI? Is it something that requires a supercomputer to have functioning at a reasonable period? Is it something that can't be done within modern technology? No. Computer AI is actually really, really, really quite simple. If you have a look at Unreal 4, you can look at something called Blackboard. And what Blackboard is it looks visually like a tree. It's a visual system. It's a lot like blueprints. And what the visual system is it's a series of conditions. And you have the place of your current computation that goes through the conditions. For example, it could be a weight, it could be a tick. And the tick says, am I close to the opponent? No. Let's approach. Am I within range of the opponent? Yes. How do I decide how to attack? Maybe I have a 50% chance to use a standard melee attack. Maybe I have a 25% chance to do a heavy melee attack. And of course, you can conditionalize way beyond that. You can have all kinds of conditions that says, is the opponent in his own heavy attack I can switch to doing a fast attack and immediately interrupt him. That's the technical layman's level. Conditionalizing AI is very cheap, very simple, very quick, very easy. So, for example, I played a game called The Ball a long time ago. Very, very, very bad puzzle-esque game. Not very engaging. But they had some opponents in it that were basically like zombies. And all they were was just basically copy-pasta of Tony's very first Unreal AI, which was basically just a straight-up approach and attack. No stalls within it whatsoever. And they were actually the most aggressive opponent of any game I've ever played. Period. Any game I've ever played. Doesn't matter the genre. Nothing even comes close to them. Because they were just constantly chasing me and constantly attacking me. They didn't pause for anything. And that was a very, very, very unusual experience. Now, obviously, I have worked with computer AI for a very long time, starting way back in 1998 with Age of Empires and StarCraft 1. And obviously, StarCraft 1 had lots of, issues with making the AI and stuff like that. But I've always pursued AI and the research of AI because when you're making mods, especially for StarCraft, it's dead. In 2003, 2004, there was basically no mod community for that game, and there never really would be ever again. Just a handful of individuals and a handful of players, and then people associated to those individuals who could be roped into it, and that's kind of it. So you just basically had to have single-player support in your mod, or nobody played it. And single-player support was effectively making the AI just build your new units. So at the layman's level, what a mod developer would do is he'd walk into the game and be like, okay, so I've added new units. And the new units is like a super heavy battlecruiser that requires a lot of resources to make. So you have to go in and tell the AI when to build it. When to build it within the tech tree. So the AI in StarCraft is just a linear series of commands that says build this, build this, build this, do this, do this, do this, do that, do that, do that. You can multi-thread some stuff, but that's beyond the context of this. So, but at the superficial level, at the player's level, when a player is engaging computer AI, then computer AI is more than just a script. It is something that is controlling all of the assets in the game. The AI is the mind behind your engagement with the story and the software. When you're playing against Kara's Fuda Zerg, the AI is the one determining what to attack you with, how often to attack you, and where to attack you. They're the ones controlling your experience with Kerrigan as a concept, which means that if the AI is not really that aggressive, you're not going to feel very threatened. If the AI is not attacking you around in different locations, if the AI is not taking advantage of opportunities you're offering to it, then Kerrigan, by extension of the AI acting on her behalf as a concept, is going to seem very unintelligent and very unthreatening. You're going to go into World of Warcraft, and World of Warcraft has all these quests that talk up these super intelligent, super strong guys, these demigods, these demons, these ancient beings, these spirits and stuff like that, and how dangerous and threatening you are. And when you're fighting them, all that's happening is they auto-attack and wait. Auto-attack and wait. Oh, now he's casting Shadow Bolt. It does maybe 1/30th of your health. Wait. Auto-attack and wait. And you kill them, and they, post some text in their final moments that's like 2 or 3 sentences long for some reason. And you continue on to the next baddie of the day. So today, I would like to introduce you guys to the concept of using AI as something more than just a series of commands that just throws units at you or reads you and makes things unfair. And bring to you the concept that AI is actually just as important as graphics. It's just as important as the actual gameplay of the project, because AI is a part of the gameplay of the project. It's just as important as audio. AI is one of the most important things in a game for the vast majority of genres out there.
Well, I can take a moment to second that last bit about the AI being really important. It's really funny when I look back at my design process for content back in, I want to say like 2015, before I ever bothered with any AI modding. It was all about designing the aesthetics of the environment, and I made some good-looking terrain, and I thought, well, this is an environment that people can explore and enjoy. And that was basically where I stopped caring about where I was placing terrain. I didn't really have much of a thought of how the AI was going to use it, how the opponents were going to use it as far as gameplay is concerned, how the player themselves. And that, I think, really hindered the overall characterization of the opponents, because I just ended up using the scripts that everybody else uses, the default campaign scripts, the computer insane, computer easy, whatever the case may be. And that was how I characterized my opponents. So when I had lines, much like these World of Warcraft dialogues, or the build-ups, you're fighting one of this big bad boss's minions, or you're fighting the warriors that are led by a certain person, it lacked all impact without a sense that this person, or this character in the world, was making decisions based on the actual impact that their gameplay had, that their attacks had on your base in StarCraft, or that their minions have in an MMORPG setting like World of Warcraft. So when you have a situation like, any of the old StarCraft campaigns, any of the classic ones that are led by Blizzard themselves, and Mesk brought up Kerrigan, obviously when you're dealing with Kerrigan, you're going to have a situation where anytime you're supposed to be fighting her in StarCraft 2 or something, she doesn't feel very intelligent. And very much so, your opponents don't feel very intelligent no matter what campaign you're playing in StarCraft 2. Amon feels entirely useless because none of his attacks are very threatening, and the very, very few that actually are just hard countered away, and very obviously heavily scripted instead of being a sort of dynamic response to behavior that you are exhibiting. So there's no counterattacks, there's no characterization of the AI as a thinking entity. It is very much just a linear, scripted sequence of events that, generally speaking, would have happened regardless of your interaction. And that means that your interaction is entirely pointless in the game space, if that makes any sense. So when you have a situation, like I'll use Kerrigan again as an example, when I sat down to work on the Nemesis Omega mod for basically a flipped version of the final mission of Brood War, where Kerrigan in the canon fought off the UED, the Dominion, and the Protoss, I actually made it so that the players, it was a 3-player cooperative map against Kerrigan, and I flipped the perspectives. And the idea was, I'm going to make Kerrigan really threatening. Obviously, I have to if the AI is going to be competitive versus 3 human players. I had to make sure that the AI was, difficult enough to actually warrant the attention of 3 different players and give them a run for their money and maybe even beat them. And that was the goal when I sat down with it. So of course I had to design an AI that was actually aggressive, that was powerful, that used things that maybe you wouldn't see from a traditional AI. And when you see that AI in action, it's worlds different than any of the Blizzard stock AIs. And, granted, I had more tools available to myself then, but when you think of like how Blizzard themselves were characterizing any of their AI or any of their characters through the AI, you don't really get a sense of anything particularly noteworthy or, consistent across the different creatures. Now, Nekron's actually studied the scripts a little bit more than I have, so maybe you can speak to this about whether or not like any of the characters, like the Overmind, for example, actually had persistent armies that you fought against, but I guess you don't really fight against the Overmind in the campaign anyways, so there's not really a lot of
we do
opportunity.
fight against the Overmind, or at least like against the Orange Brute that's protecting him, at least 3 or 4 times, I think. And it is sort of consistent in what units it uses, but not really. Like, it's not enough to notice between missions, I don't think.
Right, so it's not like a specific set of strategies like in the Hydra Rebel Yell campaign. You'll see like...
There is something like that in the campaign overall. But, well, you can debate whether it stems from laziness or from intention, because the IR Protoss, like the Conclave forces, use the same script. Just pasted over and over for like 3 or 4 missions.
Yeah, I don't know about that. That might not be intention, like you said.
Yeah. Well, it does make for some feeling of continuity, at least, where if you notice that they attack with the same stuff, it does give them a little bit of characterizations.
Well, I think the issue is there's so much opportunity for actual characterization, like what Mesk was talking about in the preamble, about how you're not just talking about army compositions, but also strategies. Does a certain AI that's being used as a representation of one of the characters like to do a lot of harassment attacks and drop on you and try to snipe your resources or something like that, like then you know, hey, that guy's the asshole that is constantly trying to kill my workers and deprive me of my expansions and whatever else. Whereas maybe there's another one that just attacks you with a sheer number of enemy units that gives you this idea that they have a large number of, like a large army in service to them, and is not really worried too much about sacrificing them by the bucket load by throwing them at your base. And the idea that when you see these characters, you are actually threatened by the strategies that they can use and the tools that they have at their disposal by which way of their armies. That is further characterization for your world. So when you're designing characters or if you're trying to do some thing where you're using existing characters from the story or something because you're making a campaign, regardless of the situation, you want to characterize your characters in such a way that makes it doesn't seem like the AI that they are using is completely separate from them as a character, because you'd think about it, they are the people who are making these strategies up. If you think about it as like a battle commander perspective, then this is somebody who is sitting here deciding what to attack with and where to attack, when to attack. And if they're making really, really poor decisions, really inept decisions every single time, then you're not going to think of them as a respectable threat. You're not going to think of them as anything but an inept commander. And I think that's mostly what Mesk was getting at with his preamble, talking about how you can actually use AI as a characterization for a thinking entity in the game world. And that goes back to the idea that when you're dealing with competitive games like what most people play Brood War for, they're trying to play the melee mode, the 1v1. And having an AI that can recreate the feeling of playing against a living entity it's not beyond the scope of writing AI scripts in Brood War's language. It's actually quite attainable if you use the tools that we have available to us now, if you're combining that with dialogue, if it's a part of a puzzle, but it's a very important part, and probably the most important part when it comes to actually designing an enjoyable experience when it comes to like actually interacting with the game world itself. And games are an interactive medium. You should want to design an internally consistent game that is the players interact with the AI and the characters at the same time while they're playing. And I think that that you don't really see that very often. You don't really see people trying to characterize their the antagonists of a story by making his armies that he sends at you in an RTS really, really potent and powerful and fearful. So I don't know if I don't know if you guys have any other thoughts on this particular topic as far as it stands to improve existing titles that otherwise don't have any characterization for the characters by way of fighting them. Like Mesk brought up World of Warcraft, and obviously we're talking about StarCraft a lot in this conversation as well. And I think both games suffer from this idea that these characters are talked up to be powerful, and they're presented in the narrative as being important and competent, but they feel anything but when you actually play against them.
So obviously something else you want to really pay attention to when you're designing this stuff is making sure you don't implement things that undermine the AI. So I'm talking specifically about Blizzard brand gimmicks. Things like capture 3 points, do this one thing, stop the trains, etc. All these gimmicks that are there just to distract you. Because make no mistake, that's why Blizzard's putting those into those things, is because they're intentionally trying to detract from actually engaging your opponents. Because there is no opponent. Because they don't have an AI. They're just using triggered waves. And sometimes, very, very rarely, bullies. I actually thought that the MOBA-esque mission, I think it was in Wangs of Liberty, where you're going through with the ghosts or
it was Tosh.
Specters or whatever. Yeah, Tosh. That was the only time in the entire game that I played. I haven't played Void. So it was Heat of the Swarm and Wangs of Liberty. It was the only time in all of those missions that I had played where I felt like an AI was actually there, that there was actually something going on. No, all they did was just build a base and then waypoint units through an area. But the fact that they built their base, that was more immersive to me than anything else in the game that I had ever seen. because it felt like there was actually something going on. In the vast majority of missions, everything is pre-placed. Nothing defends their bases. They don't even have the defense radius jacked up. They just don't do anything, and then they just waypoint stuff into you. You build your death ball, and then you just waypoint through their base, slaughtering things one after the other. And sometimes if you have difficulties because if there's a lot of units stashed in one area, you just back away. Your units are sitting in plain sight in front of them. You gather up, and then you attack again. And they're never a threat. And it was just, you're not actually playing an RTS. I mean, you're mining resources, you're building structures, you're building units, you're fighting units, destroying structures, but there's no real time because it's basically you just throwing money at money to make an equation. It's a QTE, effectively. There's no strategy because hard counters are not strategy. And once you figure out what's defending their bases, you just build something that's strong against it, usually whatever unit the mission introduces you to. And then that's it. That's it. And it's the melee, I'm going to say the attempt at melee AI for StarCraft 2 is in the wrong direction as well. StarCraft 2's melee AI is an absolute disaster. It doesn't even attempt to do what it's supposedly intended to do. It's supposed to hard counter you. It's supposed to read what you've got and build the perfect response. Well, as it is, it counters Void Rays with roaches, so it doesn't really work very well. And I'm pretty sure that to this day it still doesn't build expansion units. You can confirm or deny, but when I played Release for maybe Legacy of the Void, somewhere around there, and I looked at the AI for it, it still didn't even produce units they had added back in.
They broke the AI 2 times, first at the release of Hydro Storm and then again at the release of Legacy of the Void. It actually used to be a lot better in Link to the Liberator, I'm pretty sure. It even was capable of expanding to islands at first. Like there was one island map in Wings of Liberty, and it worked perfectly on that map. But Heart of the Swarm broke that behavior, and now they like.
Do you mean to tell me that StarCraft 2 melee AI can't expand to islands?
I'm pretty sure it can't, or if it can, it can't for its first expansion.
Wow.
Well, there is also almost no island. There's one or maybe 2 island maps in that game currently.
In my experience, it will expand to the islands, but the way it lays out its buildings means it will never build half the shit it needs to in its islands. So as an idea of just how fucked up this game is, internally. Obviously, I was designing AI that was going to hybridize, the melee functionality of StarCraft 2, having defend functions, having dynamic drop functions and stuff like that. When whatever the hard-coded crap gave you, which wasn't much, but you could take advantage of it. And then you could take advantage of anything and triggers on top of it. And it was melee AI that didn't hard counter you. It was basically Brood War. I basically made StarCraft 2 like Brood War. And you built scripts and told it what to do and stuff like that. And it was not as flexible as Brood War whatsoever. For example, in this setup, you couldn't easily tell it precisely what to attack with, just how many military units it could attack with. So it was less flexible in some regards, but if you wanted to, you could step in with triggers. But there was some things you just could not get it to behave well with. Expansions was one of them. Building structures at expansions was another. So I had an idea, my campaign initially in its concept was community members. I was going to take all these people that had played or been a part of CC and played games within CC and build AI representations out of and put them in the campaign. So Ricky Hanajase is legendary for building Reapers and putting them in bunkers. And just Reapers and Hellions and other shit. And then just expanding everywhere. And just being a nuisance to get rid of. So I thought, okay, so I'm going to have this AI. It's going to expand everywhere. And every expansion it takes, it's going to build like another 5 or 6 barracks in that expansion. So if you allow him to expand everywhere, then you're basically just going to have an ocean of infantry flooding into your base. So you have to control his expansions. Well, in general, in my tests, even in the most functional scripts, you could get him maybe building 2 or 3 barracks in his first 1 or 2 expansions by 45, 50 minutes into the game. So what you would need to do, hypothetically, is build bullies for every single expansion, for every single potential iteration of who would own that expansion, which is unreasonable, to say the least. Very, very unreasonable and defeats the entire purpose of using the melee scripts entirely. So stuff like that is why I just stopped like 6 years into it, is because I had most of it working, but it still just wasn't performing well, for one. But it also just wasn't doing what I needed it to do. I wasn't able to achieve any kind of behavior like that, even though pretty sure in Brood War you can have no problems making the AI build however many barracks inside each expansion. But
Yeah.
the concept was there, and it was a concept I had actually done in Brood War as well. My early AI mods, like 2002, 2003, I played basically strictly single player melee whenever I wasn't doing stuff with mods, and of course with mods. But in normal StarCraft, I just had the AI do random jumps to a build. And the builds could be just, massing carriers and scouts and shit. Or, building lots of siege tanks and Goliaths or whatever. So each character had a perspective to them. And I felt that this was far more of an enjoyable experience as opposed to the one that Blizzard had intended for StarCraft 2, in which the AI sees what you're doing and they always counter it. That to me is just as bad as having no AI at all, because the experience ultimately amounts to the same thing. One-dimensional. No thinking. Hard counters remove thinking. So if you've got gimmicks, which basically like half of StarCraft 2's units are just gimmicks, and an AI that just does nothing but builds something that perfectly counters whatever you're building, the interaction is still not engagement. The interaction is still a chore.
Well, the other thing to note about the whole unit, like hard countering your build or whatever, is that you have a situation now where the interactivity still comes from the player. It's what the player builds is countered by the AI. And there should be some degree of adaptation, but if the only dynamic element of the AI is determined based on what the player does, and it has nothing to do with individual personality of the AI, like, even in Command and Conquer 3, which doesn't have stellar AI, you have the idea that when you make a melee game, it says like, oh, you can make one that's like a rush focused AI. You can make one that's like tries to do timing attacks. You can make there's several profiles, and the idea there is that, well, that's way more character than just having an AI that is set to elite or whatever their difficulties.
Well, you do have AI profiles in StarCraft 2, I'm pretty sure, right now.
I never
Basically,
noticed any
the AI in StarCraft
sizable
2
differences.
Is a giant Jenga pile of individual tiny little blocks that says build this, build that, build this, build that.
Like, quite literally, I mean, you can go into a game and set the AI to be like an air-focused AI or a timed attack AI.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
They
added that in Legacy of the Void.
Oh,
those are very interesting, to say the least.
Well, if they functioned, that would be a level up over their pre-existing melee AI. That just, again, they didn't even get the intention correct, because obviously they do still hard counter air units with ground units that can't attack up. So they don't have the right thing that they were trying to go for, which was this thing where they would just reply to the player's army with a hard counter to that army. But the AI having personality is a good thing. So being able to set personalities is a good thing. But I presumably, at least from what I know of the AI prior to Legacy of the Void in Melee, I don't imagine that they were particularly stellar in their implementation of this concept.
It was the worst AI I've seen in a game since Warcraft 3. Warcraft 3 Vanilla was okay. It wasn't amazing, but it was all right. Frozen Throne gutted it. They completely gutted it. And StarCraft 2 was just like, I couldn't even believe that this was a released product. Legacy of the Void is a little bit better, but there's still like core fundamental stuff that's really messed with it, like map control and expansions and stuff like that, not to speak of the atrocious performance. I challenge any one of you to go into StarCraft 2's lobby and click add computer player to your lobby, like a 10-player lobby. Just mash that button. And then
it crashes.
Play something like Exotic Gardens with AI. It's a much, much more thorough hardware test than 3D Mark. You don't need to pay hundreds of dollars for 3D Mark. Just make a melee map in StarCraft 2 with AI. That will test your CPU quite thoroughly.
Well, the same thing happens in Warcraft 3. Now that there are 24 players maximum, it's really easy to notice this.
Actually, I ran a test with that. I made a very, very, very quick and dirty test. Those don't actually, like, they stutter. That does stutter, but it's not nearly as bad as StarCraft 2. However, there is that quote-unquote AI editor in Warcraft 3.
Don't say AI editor in Warcraft 3.
So back in the day when I was trying to build like campaigns and mods and stuff for Warcraft 3, like concepting them, blocking them out, testing stuff, I tested out this AI quote-unquote editor that generates jazz for you. And the scripts it produces have... I'm not entirely sure what's different between them and the normal Melee AI, but it's fucked. It is fucked. So I have an AI that was like Zerg. Like I turned undead into basically Zerg. They'd make like 40, 50 units. That's a lot in Warcraft 3. If anything attacked their fucking base, the game would hardlock for like 3 or 4 or 5 seconds on a 3 gigahertz dual core Athlon X2 6000. It was just mind blowing. And the only reason I could really think of why that happens is because they're issuing individual orders to every single unit and doing some kind of pathing or threat calculation or something for every single unit through Jazz, which is just ungodly slow. And that's when I stopped making mods for Warcraft 3, is when I uncovered that.
Yeah, well, hardware shouldn't matter for Warcraft 3 given its age, but it
shouldn't.
Yeah.
But that's the thing, though. When games perform bad today, it's generally not because of hardware. You are going to have to work really, really, really hard to legitimately max out a modern processor. The power of modern processors and GPUs is insane. It's massive. But what that gives people an alleged excuse to do is be more and more lazy with their programming. And lazy programming, inefficient programming, is going to be way more damning to performance than actual content. Like, look at old consoles. Look at the PSX, the PS2. The shit people get away with on that still actually performs really, really well. And that's when the technology was super, super young. Super, super young. But nobody does that today. Nobody does that kind of optimization today because it costs time and energy. And if people have supercomputers, just throw hardware at it. But the end result is shit like Warcraft 3 and StarCraft 2's AI, where it's unfucking playable, even in modern hardware in most cases.
Well, not being able to play against the AI is certainly going to stop you from being able to enjoy the experience.
That's the sole thing that prevented me from making campaigns in StarCraft 2, is the performance and the AI. I can get around the rest. I've dealt with slow editors. I've dealt with terrible UI. I'm a super lenient and super patient man. But when I can't even play my own maps with one fucking Zerg in it, then there's just no point.
Yeah, there is a guy who made a campaign that starts with like a 1 hour long microsection.
I thought you were going to say cutscene.
Well, it's a cutscene really. Which transitions into a macro map, and because he had, for some reason, he had to make the AI active from the get-go. By the time the macro starts, the game drops to like 14 frames and gets only lower from that point. So yeah, the performance is pretty bad in.
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, Annihilation.
No.
So I have an i7-920. It's an old processor, but back when StarCraft 2 came out, it was top of the line. And I've got a, when I tested this, I had a 6970 AMD GPU. And I run, my slowest hard drive that I run anything on is a Samsung F3. It's a very, very fast drive. All the other drives are like modern Western digital blacks and stuff. So my hardware is pretty good. Not good for like 10-bit encoding, but as far as games are concerned, there's nothing I can't run right now with that older GPU, except for Unreal 4 and DFGI, which is like a super prototype, unstable, highly inefficient experimental lighting engine that was later abandoned. On my current GPU, I can run that no problem. So I can run, Vermintide 2. I can run Final Fantasy 14, 100 FPS plus, easy. So we go into StarCraft 2. And I make a game on Exotic Gardens. That's the map that Ricky used for Warlords and Merchants. And I spawn some AI, lag up the lobby, and I start the game. In 5 minutes, it's a slideshow. It's a PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah, and this is
from
stock
the get-go,
AI.
it just dies.
So sure, performance is a problem, but there are way more pressing issues, I think, when it comes to AI in games in the industry overall.
Oh, yeah.
And So two main things that I tend to notice in really even new games or games that are a little bit outside of the mainstream, perhaps, like I don't know, Cossacks or Grey Goo or Red Alert 3.
No.
So first thing is everyone tries to make the AI behave in a smart way, and by smart, I mean stuff like in Warcraft 3, for example, the AI tries to retreat with low HP units, or in Red Alert 3, the AI tries to retract its units back to the base when it's in a like it has a heat map of dangerous zones over the map, and then if it's in like a very hot area, let's say, it tries to run from that area at every cost. And then
This includes them pathing into your base.
Yeah.
Yep. Or in Warcraft 3, very commonly, their army will run past your army, not retaliating as you kill every single unit they own.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the issue with that is usually, and by usually I mean almost always, the AI will just look the smartest if it actually doesn't do all that stuff and commits
if it just
its
commits all of
units
its
and suicides
exactly.
instead of trying to be smart and suiciding, but in a different way, because there's a big difference if it actually tries to, if it fights to the end with its hero instead of running in circles at 100 HP, right? Because a unit will actually do more if it fights till the end than if it tries to run at 5 HP in a situation when really often it will be not able to run in any way. So
you will get more out of the unit's budget just by fighting anyways in most cases.
Yeah. So trying to make the AI smart is one dumb thing, which, well, you can do some stuff that will make it smarter. Like, for example, in Brood War, there's a code that people, well, don't really know about, I think, where if the AI tries to path to a region through regions that are entirely occupied by enemy units, and it has a land connection there, what would normally happen is it would go by land regions and like to the preparation region. Let me start this again. So if the AI tries to prepare an attack in a region behind an enemy base that it has a ground connection to, that's like through a ramp, it will, instead of pathing through the enemy base and killing its preparing units, basically, it will instead use transports to drop there, like to avoid enemy units, and
right. So it has a
defenses.
more intelligent way of avoiding obvious threats, and that's something that in most cases will be a fine solution. There's very few cases where it could go awry, unlike all of these other things that we mentioned where they try to retreat.
So that's a smart thing, and it has like a low risk of failure, because even if it does fail and it still flies with transport over your base, it's basically the same as moving with the normal units over your base, right? So it's like not a worse case than it would normally be if it failed to execute the attack properly. And so there is smart stuff you can implement into your game that works, but companies usually really fail and go way overboard in trying to make the cute AI hardcodes.
Yeah, well, it's like the StarCraft 2 AI replicating clicks and issuing doing one action at a time instead of, or like many clicks at a time to try to simulate APM or some weird bizarre shit.
Before Blizzard changed their APM to hide superfluous clicks and changed it to EAPM, because they did that change to it. I think it still lists APM, but they hid this from the AI. The AI, if you uncapped it, it's actually using like 30k plus clicks, 30k plus APM a minute, and all that is just cycling overlords and shit like that, just pointlessly.
Right, instead of it being one action or whatever in StarCraft 1.
And then they retreat. For the workers, StarCraft 2, when you have a flag enabled, its workers will run away when you have something attack them in certain conditions. That will use 10k plus APM of them just bundling them in one place.
Oh
and
yeah,
cycling through them.
that's also a smart quote unquote behavior that's really dumb because they will stop mining and also won't help in defending. So you have like 50 workers idling for no reason while the
Yeah, they're
enemies
being
attacking them.
pursued by one Zergling, dude. They
And they're
can't fight
just-
back.
They're just gonna go to one spot and just get murdered anyways. Like, just you're better off just having one command that Control A right clicks minerals on an expansion and sends them over to an expansion, as opposed to trying to move them around your base.
So the other thing that game devs usually fail to deliver is actually having the AI use all of the game's, like even basic mechanics. So in Brood War, the AIs won't use night assess. They want like the base spellcasting AI doesn't really, it doesn't really use all abilities properly. Lurkers fail to burrow often when attacking.
Yeah, I don't think Consume is even there for the AI.
Yeah,
by
Consume
default.
is never used. It's really nowadays it's really easy to implement using guide loaders, right? But in the vanilla game, it's completely unused. Infest is also unused in the vanilla game. So they have 2 completely unused abilities.
Well,
Right?
3
Is
if you
it
count the
right?
Nidus.
Yeah, sure. 3 if you count the Nidus. Then Protoss.
Sometimes shield batteries will kind of screw with unit micro, but most of the
shield
time
batteries also don't. Well, overall, the base point is even in different games. It's really dumb to bring examples from Cossacks, but I can bring an example from StarCraft 2 because in that game the AI also doesn't use night assess, and in the campaign. In StarCraft 2, the AI doesn't even use abilities pretty often.
well, they also don't even build stuff, so what are you going to do?
Well, there's no AI, right? But they don't use cloak or anything. So basically, the AI doesn't use all of the base capabilities it can within a game. And this is also pretty dumb because it's really cool to see the AI having the same possibilities as you. It's cool to, in a way, because it's also annoying, right? But it's cool to be dropped by an Eidos or just be dropped in general through overlords or smart shuttle or dropship. Use that. It's cool to see brokers actually properly used in attacks and stuff like that.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a complicated system of checks and balances to be functional and satisfying. The idea is that you're interacting with something that could believably be another player, ideally.
Yeah.
And, there are plenty of players that play worse than a lot of the AI in the base game, I guess. But when you're a veteran and you want to be challenged, or you at least want to go up against something that feels alive and feels genuine, then, you're, by and large, you're not going to get anything out of most games' interpretations of AI. We've focused a lot on RTS examples because that's where we do a lot of our work, but in
other games, if you want to depart for a little bit from these examples, for example, in fighting games, there usually is no proper AI. There is just a script that responds to your inputs. So that's obviously not very satisfying because that's quite possibly the most annoying thing you can fight against, especially on higher difficulties when it immediately reads what you're doing and responds with combinations that are almost inhumane when it comes to the speed of how fast are they executed. And in most action RPGs, you don't even really have proper AI. You just have a monster that walks around in cycles and spawns new units. Well, I guess in Path of Exile, you do actually have unit AI that varies from monster to monster. But in Diablo, it's, no. You only have stuff that's
familiar with Devil May Cry 3.
No, I'm not familiar with that game.
No.
Devil May Cry 3 is the only action RPG. Now, remember, I classify stuff like God of War is basically the same as Diablo. They're basically action RPGs. The only difference is isometric. And as far as all the games I've played of that nature, like the third person or the isometric, Devil May Cry 3 is the only game I've played that has some AI in it. And I'm thinking specifically of, well, actually, I can talk about a Devil May Cry 4 mod, but I'm going to do that a little bit later. So you have Virgil, and you fight Virgil 3 times in this game. And each time you fight him, he has some new abilities. Now, Virgil is really actually pretty simple. And when you think about fighting games and action RPGs and stuff like this with different moves and different speeds and stuff like this, having input reads in it is necessary to a stage. But one of really the big issues about these is the input reads are immediate. So there's a lot of games which basically is just a scripted response. You do this, I do that. Dark Souls is very bad for this. Very bad for this. Where I was noting in Dark Souls 3, I was firing arrows that wouldn't even have a chance of hitting a unit, and they're just rolling automatically every single time. Just all completely two-dimensional pathing, yet input reads all over the place. And most of these games are really bad for that. God of War, I managed to shut down the AI for units, and I was able to fondle the puppies and play around with them, and I made note that every single time you tried to grab them or anything like that, they had a scripted, automated attack that they immediately performed. Even though their actual AI was shut down, they were just standing there, and I could just kill them without any retaliation. But anytime you tried to like grab them or do anything like that, they would automatically respond, and it really like shows you how the units are actually designed.
Yeah, it's just a call and response.
Yeah, it's just an automated response. But when you have a fighting game and stuff like that, if the AI doesn't attempt to do something, it's very easy to abuse them. So the main thing that when I was brainstorming with another designer about this, who was building AI for Diablo 2, the main thing that I came up with is that the delays should be based on actual players. Now, I believe that he said that some of the fastest fighting game player responses is somewhere around like 20 ms. So that would be like top tier, top line professional. So if you were to change a difficulty setting for a game, like an action RPG or a fighting game, the only thing the difficulty setting should really be changing is some of the combinations they use. Like there's some like 30, 40, 50 plus hit combos you can do in Blaze Blue that obviously you have to practice a lot for. Maybe they can't perform that. But also you would just change the delays for some of the things they do. And then that can be scaled down based on an analysis of actual player responses. So when I was talking earlier about the blackboard where you have a condition before you make a thing, that condition would be the input rate. And then you can have a randomized weight between there that averages around the actual responses of a player. Because not every player is going to ignore what you're doing. A lot of them are going to read what you're doing. A lot of them are going to predict what you're doing, which, by the way, you can do in an AI as well. You can build predictions on them based on things. Learning AI, as it's so called. When learning AI is a very scary thing, because whenever you talk about learning AI, you get into the hypothetical theory crafting shit that nobody has ever done correctly. But the theory is an AI learns what you do and builds off of that, and is super advanced. Well, you don't need it to be super advanced. A learning AI at the simple layman's level is you are doing nothing in a fighting game but shooting ranged attacks to chip. So the AI will learn that you've used this attack X times, and now it's going to alter the conditions in its script and become more aggressive and try to close distance with you and be more evasive as time goes on. That's a very example of a learning move. It's actually very simple to do stuff like that. It's just using variables. It's very, very basic stuff. No games do that. Now, I was bringing up Devil May Cry because Devil May Cry 1, as we mentioned before, it was a game that most Americans thought were too hard. It sold well. A lot of people liked it, but a lot of people thought it was too difficult. And I'm not really sure why, because it was an easy game. So God of War came out. God of War has basically no AI in it at all. It's all like input reading, scripted responses and stuff like that, and then gimmicks. And then what gameplay there was in Devil May Cry, they took out and they replaced it with QuickTime events. Simon Says, lower the skill ceiling, everybody can play, including people who don't know how to play games. So Devil May Cry 3 was an advancement from Devil May Cry 1. Devil May Cry 2 was kind of an interesting game, but you could just take a rocket launcher and kill everything in the game once you got it. So it definitely had issues. But Devil May Cry 3 was the first really major attempt by the developers to really, like, they were comfortable and they really got into it. There's some fights in it that really aren't that good, but Virgil and stuff like that are very interesting because I don't think they really capture like a personality very well, but I think the technical execution is like the baseline of what everybody should be expecting. So Virgil's second fight in particular. So it's like a fighting game. It's an action RPG. It's third person, but it's like a fighting game, and it's a duel. And duels are where these games are at their strongest because they're where you can interact with all the game's mechanics. Now, Nekron was talking about how a lot of AIs don't actually use the game's mechanics, which is very much a problem, regardless of genre. And Virgil actually does use and is interacted with a lot of the game's mechanics. He has some advantages on behalf of being a boss. For example, his devil trigger and stuff like that behaves very differently. But you get yourself into a state where you actually have to think about what the AI is doing and what the AI wants to do. And Virgil is very patterned. There's usually patterns to these things, which just isn't necessarily a bad thing. In most cases, it amounts to a bad things. But in some cases where the AI has advantages, patterns are necessary for you to actually be able to do anything. For example, Dark Souls is a turn-based game, and it's turn-based because of the patterns that they use. So you have to weave in and out. And DMC is a little similar, but you typically have more actual control over the pattern. Which means to say that Virgil, usually if you attack him straight up when he's attacking, you will either get parried or get hit. So usually you want to weave in immediately after he's attacking and hit him. And he has several different combos he shifts between. He's actually pretty aggressive. He can do quite a bit of damage to you pretty quickly. But Devil May Cry is one of those games where it's balanced in that, unlike God of War on the higher difficulties, if you get hit once by them, you won't lose like 3/4 of your health. But, you know, consistent failures will get you pretty heavily punished. Now, I think Virgil is really like, I really like, it's hard for me to really put in words without really going on for a long time, but I really recommend anybody who's really interested in AI and wants to see a fairly positive, not a perfect, but a fairly positive example, you want to see the second Virgil fight in Devil May Cry 3. And that is really like the whole thing in general, I think is one of the strongest examples of third-person combat in every respect. Not just the AI, but also the controls and the balance and stuff like that. I think that's one of the strongest things that is... but actually playing it is better than watching it. I think if you watch some speedrun or some power combo video, it's not really going to show it. But I really, really heavily recommend anybody interested to get into DMC3. So Pornogo is linking the thing here, and I believe this is it. Yes, it is. So,
all right, I'll go through that in the chat.
The thing about these videos is if you're watching them on YouTube, these are fights which if you're a new player like I was, you're not going to get through this in the first attempt, even on normal difficulty. So this is much more styled, similar to what I would intended the lower difficulty for my games to be like, where, you know, if you're a new player who don't know what's going on, you are going to lose. You're going to have to improve. That's the entire intent, is to encourage you to learn and improve. YouTube videos typically don't show failures. LPers don't typically show failures. So that's why I usually don't recommend looking into these videos, but as a context, it's all right. So you can see some of the interactions in here, but this guy is obviously a fairly decent player, but he's still taking damage, so it's all right. So when you think about ways that the AI presents the game, DMC 3 especially is very much about the two brothers, Dante and Virgil. So these three fights where you're going up against Virgil, they're supposed to be very critical parts of the game. They're very, very critical parts of the game. They're not just critical parts in terms of the difficulty of the fights. I think I spent, I can't remember the time, but I'm going to say around an hour and a half or longer on that fight alone. And I didn't have as much issues on Oreo and S'mores. And I had some issues on Cerberus, and there's one other fight in that game I had some issues with. But this fight in particular really held me up for a really long time. Because I had... Basically, when I played these games, I get really, really aggressive. because most of these games do not punish you, and there is no AI to punish you. A lot of things can be very unfair and imbalanced, like the stuff in Lords of Game Testing, where ground-based shockwave attacks will knock you right out of the air from like 10 feet above them. Very, very annoying, very imbalanced, very unfair, all because they decided to have air combat in the game, but they couldn't be asked to actually put air combat into the game. So every time you go in the air, you get punished for it. So, but in 99% of these games, you can play insanely aggressively and never get punished for it, including Dark Souls and stuff like that. So the thing about when you encounter fights like Dante, which the AI is actually being aggressive and does have some tools to counter you, and you have to stop and think, I had to basically rewrite the entire way that I approached the game up to that point. Even though I'd already had some fights in it that were exceptionally difficult, I had to reconsider a lot of things. I had to actually sit down and improve. I had to do this a lot in Dark Souls 3 as well, because Dark Souls 3 is all about punishing you. And there's no AI in that game. It's all sequences and some input reads, mostly sequences and patterns. And it's all about punishing you. Dark Souls 3 is kind of like an elaborate QTE, but there is pattern recognition, which is more like a shmup. So it's kind of a mix of QTE, and then there's pattern recognition in it. And then there's timing. So the pattern is very, very timing based. So it's very different. So if Dark Souls had an AI, and it does have AI in some very specific parts, some of the phantoms, I forget her name, but she is the final, or one of the final fights you can have within the second DLC. The Ring City, I can't remember her name. She would be in my last video, the last boss that I fought. I don't know if you've seen the video or not. But so she has like a staff, and the staff can do like a stun, and she also has a bow. And the basic function of this AI is, you know, I heal when you're out of range, I roll to avoid attacks, I switch to my ranged weapon when you enter a certain range away from me, when you leave a certain range. And then she also has a buff and stuff like that. Very simple. Very simple. But that was one of the best fights in the game. For all of Dark Souls 3. That was one of the best fights in the game. Very simple. These huge telegraphic bosses and indicators and stuff like that, all that detracts from experience. They detract from engagement. They're like exposition. You walk into a campaign, you get a half-hour cinematic. That's what walking into God of War and getting one of these huge quick-time event fights with all the camera shaking and indicators is like. It's like, I'm waiting for the game to actually start. It's very boring. Because you're not fighting, you're just performing a quick time event. There's no real thinking going on. Some of the attacks are positional and stuff like that, but it's basically jump over shockwaves, attack the weak spot, run around and wait for him to do whatever. You know, mash this button. There's no thinking involved. It's once you know the sequence you're supposed to perform, it's just that's it. The game's done, you know? That's why I like these dual fights like Virgil and stuff like that. And whenever anybody talks to me about AI, whenever I bring up examples about AI, I go right back to Virgil. Because this is basic. This is super basic stuff. Super, super basic stuff. And anybody can see what's going on here. And that's why it's a great example. Because it's done well. And it's at the stage where anybody can see what's going on. Of course, playing it is very different than watching it. But even as an example, while watching it, I'm pretty sure you can see that there's more interactivity going on in here than, for example, the bosses in Diablo 3. Which stand there, have hard-coded stalls, they wait and attack. Wait and attack. And
I can't help but call back to the Skeletoni King boss that we just completed.
They always go invulnerable and spawn ads too. The Skeletoni King isn't quite as bad for that as many other bosses in that game, but Blizzard basically goes into a formula where the boss goes invulnerable or goes off screen and ads spawn. And it's all a detraction.
Yeah, the last fight in vanilla game actually has a sequence where the boss completely disappears from your field of view for like prolonged periods of time, 30 seconds or something, and spawns ads during that time, and you can't interact with him in any way.
Like, in some cases, that can make an interesting mechanic, an interesting divergence, but considering that in Diablo 3, when you're doing it as current content, you know, for your gear level and level and stuff like that, they have insane health pools and they don't actually engage you. So all it does is just prolong the fight even more. It just is really just time gating. And time gating is cancer. In an ideal game world, be it something like Brood War or something like Devil May Cry, Once you have outsmarted your opponent, you should be able to concisely end the fight. You should be able to end it pretty quickly. You can do that with Virgil. It can take a really long time to kill him if you don't abuse him when he opens himself up to be abused. When you can take advantage of stuff like, him attacking and then coming in from the side or whatever. If you do it quickly, you can kill him very fast. This video here, this is a pretty fast kill, but I'm pretty sure you can go a lot faster than that. In my fight, I think it took forever because he kept healing because I wasn't punishing him enough, because my execution wasn't good enough. I wasn't taking advantage. And in Dark Souls as well, you can kill some things extremely fast in there if you've mastered, like if you watch the speedruns, you basically are just going to see them abusing stagger and certain weapons and buffs and stuff like that. And some bosses will just go down in seconds. That can otherwise take an extraordinarily long time to figure out the patterns for. So that's good. I think that's like a very strong positive in Dark Souls' favor, is the fact that most of the bosses just don't have arbitrary walls of health.
Yeah, well, the reason why I brought up Diablo 3's Skeleton King as an example is because not only have we all just played it recently, but like the interaction was just left-clicking and right-clicking. Yep. You're using two abilities or whatever, and eventually he goes down.
Stand there and just push your cooldown for healing every now and then if you get hit by something.
So it actually takes less time than the boss fight that we linked in the chat up there, and yet there was so much more actual interaction with the game in that video that I was able to see, and it feels way like a world of difference, despite the fact that it was actually a quicker fight in the latter example.
I'd like to flesh one more thing out, and that's... Well, Mesk at one point said that in Dark Souls 3, most of the enemies don't have an AI, but instead have a collection of sequences of things to do. And ultimately I think, even earlier, like at the very beginning of this podcast, Pronogo also said that everything in StarCraft 2's campaign is scripted. And those two things are bugging me a little bit, because an AI... Yeah. Like, you said that it's... well, maybe Mesk actually said that everything Kerrigan does is just based on a very hard-coded script, right?
Yeah,
it never changes and stuff.
But,
so,
I mean, that
wait
is
X
true,
seconds,
though.
you do this. Yeah.
What?
It's like basically the stuff in StarCraft 2 is basically wait X seconds.
Oh yeah,
do
yeah,
this.
sure.
Just a script, yeah.
But that's also what basically scripts in World War are ultimately, I think. And overall, AI in games is usually just a collection of sequences, nothing more.
Mm-hmm.
Because while you can make it react to the player's actions, it's ultimately really often very, very unfun if you make it like that. Like hard countering is dumb and unfun, right? We can agree on that properly. And I don't think it's like necessarily bad that stuff is scripted, because like you said, if the player has a disadvantage, things have to be scripted in some way so that he can actually learn to combat the script eventually.
I think it all comes down to execution. So say, for example, in Brood or StarCraft 2, and probably Brood War to an extent as well, a lot of AI is basically just fed money, and then if it can build the units, the timer comes up and it just has the units, or they just spawn, regardless. Whereas in something like, for example, in Brood War, typically speaking, if you have an AI that is also based on timers, you can affect those timers by destroying the economy, by destroying the buildings, and doing stuff like that. You can actually interact with them. It's also going to be interactive based on the AI's actual presence on the map. So if the AI is expanding and has lots of resources and the timer comes up to say, build 30 Metalisks, and it has the money to build 30 Metalisks, it's going to build 30 Metalisks. But if it's been denied map presence, then the timer comes up to say, build 30 Metalisks, and it's going to take a lot longer to build 30 Metalisks. The interaction for the player is, I have affected the AI. I have dealt damage to my opponent. Now that the opponent is trying to do something, it's feeling the effects of that damage. It's going to take a much longer to do so. StarCraft 2 is very binary because everything is very static. There is no map control. There is destroying the buildings and then not destroying the buildings. Doing anything else in the game basically has no impact whatsoever. The vast majority of units it has just stand around and do nothing anyway.
Well, important to note is that in Legacy of the Void, the buildings don't actually matter anyways because all the waves are spawned through drop pods. So even if you destroy the bases, you probably won't be removing the threat of the enemy army, which is like the exact... I mean, it's probably one of the reasons why your objectives all have nothing to do with destroying an enemy base and are entirely about, you know, following the gimmick to its natural conclusion or whatever.
Like, timers are just a tool. And a tool in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, like input rating. Input rating is going to be necessary to some extent in certain systems, but it all comes down to how you use it. How you use tools ultimately determine them. The big issues with the timers and the scripts and stuff in StarCraft 2 is that is all that's going on other than the gimmick. So it brings it up to the forefront every single time anything happens is, oh, this timer passed. Oh, I did this and there was a scripted response. That's all there is. Supreme Commander is even worse for this, where whenever you complete an objective and a map transition happens, because basically the map grows bigger and more stuff is exposed to you, every single time that happens, you are hit with an overwhelmingly massive attack. There's just this sudden burst of aggression every single time you complete the objective. So the common strategy for those games is to turtle up, tech out, and wait while you have the objective basically held until you finish it. And you finish it only when you're prepared to finish it, then you weather that massive attack, and then the rest of the game is just piss easy again. So that's like an extreme version of what StarCraft 2 is doing, in which there's always going to be this response. And as a result, the player doesn't expect interactivity. The player is just basically performing Simon Says. They had to have this much budget to deal with that much budget. There's no further interaction and engage with it. The system is not at fault for that. You can certainly make use of timers, make use of scripts and stuff like that, and come up with beneficial and more interactive things with them. But you have to do more than just, you know, spawn 30 milisks at 10 minutes and be done with it. Because you're basically distancing the player from the opponent when you do that. If you don't have some kind of mechanism driving the opponent's actions, like them expanding to fund those units and stuff like that, then you've got problems. That's what Brood War scripts are at their heart as a concept is, you know, you build up your economy, you build up your tech, everything else just like a player would, and then you make units. And the weights and stuff involved are typically there to give breathing room to the script to get through its functions and not trip over itself. Or because you're timing things to a map. And that is an advantage you can have with a campaign map over a melee AI, which is what I've traditionally dealt with as melee AI. Is a campaign map lets you tailor timings and stuff to the map. But in most cases, people just focus explicitly on those timers and not on the interactivity. And then that's where you get StarCraft 2, in which the campaign doesn't even use the AI that's in the game at all to begin with. That's why you don't have defending or anything like that.
Yeah, well, I think what it comes down to is that the script is making the AI opponent perform actions that the player also performs in something like Brood War, whereas in StarCraft 2, it's performing actions that are completely alien, like spawning units. The player doesn't have access to those mechanics. So the AI is actually playing basically a different game than the player, and
that's unavoidable, though. That's unavoidable. The AI is always going to have advantages and disadvantages to the player. You have to accept that as a designer right up front. If you try to humanize the AI, you're wasting your time.
Right.
You know, like you guys were saying.
Right. So in the context of Brood War, though, yes, the AI is oftentimes fed money, but you can still tailor the script to make sure that you build a lot of production structures at your expansions, and that adds value for the player to destroy those expansions.
I think the best way of doing it is actually the way StarCraft 2 can do it, which is adding a multiplier on the mining amount. So the AI has to be mining to get money and just gets a bit more money.
Yeah, I could see where that could be effective.
Because that's what Insane AI does in StarCraft 2. But
right.
The thing about that with StarCraft 2 is it starts with a huge chunk of money. That's what makes the Insane AI dangerous in StarCraft 2, is because when the game first starts, that's as close to the player it's ever going to be in terms of its actual units. But the AI is getting a massive chunk of increased income. Then what happens is they don't expand, they don't take the map, and they actually just run out of resources afterwards. Despite having, the increased income.
So I don't know how this relates to the point you were bringing up, Nekron, but feel free to continue where you left off.
Wow. Oof, it's hard to continue where I left off now. But I can add to this by saying that I don't think it's actually worthwhile to try and emulate mining in any manner that's faithful for the AI, because the player won't be able to keep track of how much the AI is mining anyway.
Well, I mean, it depends on the use case scenario. If the AI has one base at the start, just like the player does, and they're on even ground at the beginning, then how does the AI's strengths, in my opinion, they should come from the idea that they are tireless. They will never get bored. They will never be weary of the actual experience of playing the game. Whereas the player is more susceptible to stuff like that. That they have a limit of their attention span, a limit of the actions that they can complete, and obviously there's fatigue that plays within really long hour-plus RTS missions that are demanding from the first moment until their conclusion. The AI doesn't have that limitation, so that should be, I think, probably one of its only advantages over a computer or a human player, rather. Whereas, obviously in StarCraft 1, you have to give it a bunch of money if you want it to be able to perform in any capacity. And that's why Melee AI often hangs up on itself. So, it's obviously a lot different in something like StarCraft 2, where the AI also, or Warcraft 3, where a lot of custom campaigns make the AI build units way faster. Obviously, the units that the AI builds in the default campaigns are sometimes broken, like any of the Naga units are completely busted in terms of a game balance standpoint. StarCraft 2 has entirely different army compositions than the player has access to in their entire capacity of as playing. So
building faster can also be a solution to a technical limitation. In StarCraft 1, I really often find that it's making the AI build stuff faster is the only reliable way to actually make it a mass attack properly on big maps. Because otherwise it will almost always time out while trying to prepare big attacks.
Yeah, well, you never use quick attack for some reason, so...
Well, I would actually need attack timeout for this instead of quick attack, but okay.
No, you don't. The idea is that the AI has a certain amount of time to amass its army, and then it quick attacks. So, I mean, this is completely worthless for people who don't know how the script code works, so I won't labor the point, but basically, if I want a big attack that's being assembled and then executed by an AI, I will have the AI wait usually a minute, sometimes a minute and a half, before executing with whatever forces it has amassed during that time. And even if it's requested something, that like a battlecruiser or a carrier or something, that requires a larger build time than the wait allows, the idea is that it should have some in reserve, and if the player has destroyed some in reserve, then they won't have to deal with them in the next attack, or they have increased the likelihood that they will be free of that. So it promotes aggression and interactivity with the AI. Whereas
that doesn't match with the game mechanics in this case, because replenishing the guards every cycle is not a reliable way of making sure that the player has done everything, something to the AI in the recent time period. Because he might have destroyed a carrier 10 minutes ago, and because of the way how guard replenishing works, it's still not respawned. And I don't really consider 10 minutes to be a
I haven't personally
reasonable
experienced that case, but I suppose we could discuss other usages in a more technically minded podcast if we end up learning more information about this particular thing. I don't think that making the AI cheat in a way that the player cannot, giving the AI more advantages over the player than it already has based on being an AI, is a solution, though. And since you already have to give it advantages in the resource department, I don't really see a way how this benefits interactivity with the AI. I think if you wanted to have a really big attack, you need to make it work in the context of what the limitations of the engine provide with you, or you need to unlimit the engine, which hopefully we can do with updates to the guard logic, but those have been in the request list for a year or so.
I never used guards.
Well,
you presumably have used them if you made any campaign map ever in existence.
Nope. Mesk
Okay.
only made melee stuff.
I think I use Gars to put defilers in some places. Because whenever I told the AI to train defilers, I would have 50 defilers and no
Yeah,
military
that's
units.
now you know what that happens because
yes, it
it
was
didn't look
insane.
into X while training.
It's just it's just mind-boggling how it does that specifically for those units really, really badly. You just end up with so many queens and so many defilers, and I was like, well, Blizzard has placed guard defiler and they don't have 50 defilers, so I guess I'll use it for that. And it was dumb fooling around.
Actually, what's interesting is that it does look into X in the attack training algorithm. So if you attack added one queen instead or attack added one defiler, it would work properly. Which is pretty dumb in itself because it means that Blizzard has coded looking into X into one part of the game, but then forgot into the one that actually could use that.
That's very typical for Blizzard.
Yeah.
It's very, very typical.
Probably.
Diablo 2 is just filled with case-by-case copy-paste hacks and mild changes like that don't backport fixes or anything. It's amazing and just terrifying at the same time.
The training for Atagat is actually way better than normal train command. In multiple instances, it's not affected by the same bugs. It's like more reliable. So overall, it's like really dumb that they haven't ported the same solutions to train itself.
Well, that's what
I doubt
Nave is
anyone
for.
on their staff would even know how to at this stage. I doubt they have anyone on staff who knows anything about the code for that game. Just the people in Remastered who'd backport middleware. That's basically it.
Backport middleware sounds like a band from Wisconsin.
Well, Remastered boggles my mind because if they had anyone competent, he could log on to StarReddit, download Nif's plugin, and actually improve the game severely just by the virtue of using the code Nif has researched up until now. It's like really weird to me that they are not willing to go that far and asking for permission to use his code or anything. And instead,
well, it's not. We talked about this on I think the last podcast as well. It's not just the developers because there are builds with solved issues that'll never get shipped because you have to ask permission to fix your game now.
Yeah, I guess.
At any rate, the main takeaway from a discussion on AI, any discussion on AI, is that if you're playing against an AI opponent, it should be a substitution for another human player, and it should feel alive to some degree.
Well, it shouldn't really.
No, it should.
It should just be more or less a puzzle you should be able to solve eventually with enough skill and time.
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Well, you will never make the AI an effective substitution for a player because it doesn't have imagination, right? It only can go as far as you've made it go in beforehand.
It can learn from the player's examples, like we were discussing earlier. Like Mesk brought up the learning a player's, attack patterns or whatever in a fighting game.
Sure, it can, and well, it can react.
It depends on the difficulty.
Sure.
It depends on what you're trying to go for difficulty, right? But I think that it making it feel like a living entity, something that's not just a static set of actions. How is it not fun?
What do you mean? I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory in my mind that.
Well, it's not for me. So
making it a living, making it learn and behave like a living being, causes it to actually boils down to making it so it basically just hard counters you, or cheeses you, or always looks for the most effective strategy.
No, because it could be incorrect in the strategy it chooses, or it could not be a fully complete selection. Like just seeing that the player is using constantly spamming ranged attacks in a fighter game, right? Like doesn't mean that it now knows that what the solution is. It just means I'm going to try to stop them from.
We can't translate AI in fighting games and in RTS games one-to-one from each other.
Well, not one-to-one, but you can take, the patterns from them.
You can't take almost anything.
Why not? Is it not just the player is playing a character, the player is playing a race. Each one of these has unique mechanics based on, AI is controlling a different race, perhaps, or the same race, just like the AI
Your
could control a different
inputs
fighter.
and the speed in which the AI, the opponent, needs to react to your inputs are widely different between an RTS game and between a fighting game.
Yeah, but you can. I don't understand why you can't compartmentalize the inputs and the responses necessary. So if you have an example of using ranged attacks constantly, you can just use that. They're building mass dragoons or something, or like an army composition that is mostly about ranged, and then the AI reads that you have a lot of ranged units and tries to build Dark Swarm, or tries to build Defiler and use Dark Swarm.
Well, then you end up with another free AI, which builds 30 bullfrogs whenever you build their units.
Well, that's just... I think you're kind of strawmanning the position into a really, really edge case scenario of something that's like a really extreme...
Oh, no, I don't think so. Mesk was talking about AIs with personalities. Well, we were all talking about AIs with personalities a little bit earlier. But he brought an example of a guy who would build a lot of 3% hellbats and expand very rapidly and have bunkers with rippers all over the map, right?
Yeah, and that feels more alive than just doing the same thing every time.
Sure. So how would you make this guy react to the enemy building a lot of stalkers? Would he just ignore that part of his script completely and start building tanks instead?
No. I mean, there's something within his personality that would theoretically be decent at dealing with those units. Like Marauders are infantry. Marines do pretty well against stalkers.
How far are you willing to stretch a personality to accommodate?
Again, that depends on the personality, right? I'm talking about making it feel like it's an actual entity in the game world, making it feel immersive.
Well, it can be an actual entity without learning from the player or without reacting to everything you do, without reading your inputs.
And reading... So we just talked about why reading your inputs could be a positive or a negative. You gave the example of Red Alert 3. Mesk gave the example of the reaction to spamming ranged attacks in a fighting game, which can be contrasted or converted into an RTS environment by somebody who's hard countering a build or something, or trying to counter a build with one unit type. So it can be a positive thing. It can prevent an environment where the player is allowed to squeeze by doing something like massing void rays, and it's obviously you could do extreme examples like the AI in StarCraft 2 building roaches. And obviously that's like a failed example, though, in my mind. I don't look at it as something that is like a genuine attempt at the act. Like what it comes down to is when you're fighting against another player, they have their own personality too, and they have their own strategies that they favor. So when you're dealing with an AI and it has a personality and it tries to win the game based on its own, like what its personality allows it to do, you can conceive of the personality as like a set of rules, then obviously it's going to have to react in some way to what you're doing. But it in a script level, its reaction may be to continue doing what it's doing and wait for more changes, wait for more data, just like a human player might do. But I don't see, like, when you're... What exactly is what is the umbrage that you take with the idea that an AI should be somewhat adaptive and like a genuine entity in the world space? Like, because again, this is going back to the very first thing we talked about on the podcast, which is AI should be something that you interact with. So, like a representation of a character, or in Mesk's example, a individual in the community. Turned into a character in the game world.
It can be that without reacting to anything more than actual game events. Or obviously AI will always react to being attacked and react tools into expansions and stuff, or at least it should. But I don't think it's correct to say that it also should always attempt to. Well, now I'm just umming.
Thinking.
Yeah, quite literally.
I think what he's trying to say is that the AI shouldn't break from the framework you've laid out for it in terms of the personality. So in the case of, for example, Ricky_Honajase, the French hero of the ages, building nothing but fucking Reapers and Marines. And in this map, the player has access to they had access to tanks, they had access to air and stuff like that. So when I designed the AI, and for like the most basic AI for Apex, so Apex adds like many units and many races and stuff like that, and some of them are pretty strong. And when I build the AI personalities, I think about, okay, so I don't want the AI to have to break out of this mold, its personality, to hard counter something the player is doing. So I'm going to design the player's personality in a way in which it has a way to approach what the player is doing. So, for example, the example in this case would be spamming siege tanks versus infantry. Well, the siege tanks were not going to have hit scan in this. I was going to remove hit scan from basically everything that had it because hit scan is fucking stupid in an RTS, and I don't know why it exists in StarCraft 2. So tanks would be a little less insanely strong against infantry than they were, but their damage was being returned to the way it was in StarCraft 1, so they were going to be a net result of being pretty lethal. So the way that Ricky, the specific example, is intended to approach something like this is tanks are generally static. Whereas Ricky was going to expand very aggressively. So Nekron was talking about how basically abstracting the process of the computer player mining resources to the player is usually worthless, and I agree with that. I was giving them not infinite resources, so at least if you made a focused attempt to destroy their economy, you get some kind of benefit out of it. But there's basically no illusion that the AI is ever going to spend its economy well, so it has to be handheld through it. These are concessions you have to make when designing AI. Is there's just going to be things it just can't do. And
I feel like it could do that in a perfect world where you're designing an RTS and Unreal 4 or something. You could design AI management code, but obviously
we're talking about like mods and stuff.
Right. Yeah.
So we don't have a perfect world. So we have to kind of deal with the imperfections. And the system that we're trying to employ, at least I was trying to employ within Apex, is Ricky is very stubborn and will not build anything besides this. So the way in which he's going to deal with the player is the player may choose to spam tanks. They may choose to build heavy units, and they may choose to wall up and just be slaughtering his infantry. Like there's some cases where Ricky will run into one of the other AIs that builds corvettes and heavy tanks, and he loses like all 50, 60 of his Marines in the span of like 3 or 4 seconds, which is super fast for this because combat is usually a lot slower. But because they're in a defensive position and Ricky attacks them up a ramp or something, they just get murdered. And that's okay, because those are slower static units. And the way I had designed it was, so Ricky is going to build nothing but these cheap, fast units. So in order to make that threatening to somebody who has something that's much stronger, then he's going to need some kind of way to keep the aggression going. His balance is less about what he builds. It's less about his composition and more about map control. So that's why he was intended to rapidly expand across the map and build production buildings for every single expansion. So of course the issue I was having when the AI was refusing to build buildings very reliably at expansions, that directly affected the design. So that was like something I really wasn't sure if I was ever going to really be able to fix or not. But at the superficial level, the way of Ricky countering you is by an extent of a game mechanism where you're killing all of his units, but he just keeps making more and more, and it becomes a battle of attrition. So you actually have to be super aggressive. You actually have to go into his bases and start destroying them to actually make headway against them, because he'll be aggressively expanding everywhere. I think the timer for his expansions was 1 every 2 or 3 minutes. And the map had quite a few expansion spots. So the other way of balancing Ricky was, because of how aggressive he was expanding, is even if he managed to destroy his main base, he would just simply start building all this stuff at some random expansion all over the place. So he could, if you ignored him, because this was a free-for-all map. This wasn't a 1v map. This was a free-for-all map. There was about 6 players in it. So if you ignored Ricky and the other AIs didn't finish him off, he would just rebuild, and then all the Marines and stuff would come pouring out again. He also built transports. That's basically a core thing, is all the AI builds transports, at least to have them available if it needs them. So what Nekron is saying is that it would be very detrimental to, say, have Ricky build Goliaths completely out of nowhere to counter you because you started building air, and I agree with that. So I think that there was going to be some cases, specifically in the 1v1 missions, where I'd have to have some adaptability, where the AI responds to certain things, but there is some things that the AI cannot really respond to. There's some things the AI is never really going to be able to deal with. And in a fighting game, there's really only so many things you can do when you're in a position. And you can really needle point the AI into having an adequate response, not necessarily a hard counter, but a response of some kind to every single one of those cases. So for example, if you were in a corner, there's only so many ways you can block, only so many ways you can get out of the corner. Maybe you can use a super or something to iframe, stuff like that. So the AI can account for this stuff. In Brood War, there is a billion different variables that could happen, down to every individual feature of the terrain in every individual area. And there's only so many you can account for. So within StarCraft 2, I was going to have tactical AI for casters and pretty much all the units that just made them behave a little bit more intelligently. So a basic one is when Ravens and stuff cast Seeker Missile, they back away. They retreat. They get out of the way. For one, so they stop taking damage if they're being attacked, and for two, to make room for the rest of their units. So the Zerg in 0x05 one of the Zergs built nothing but infestors. He got like 50 infestors. And the infestors would just fly up to you and spam infested Terrans in an ocean. And every time they expended their mana, they would then back away and make room for the other infestors. So this is an example of making the AI smarter, more human-like in a way, but also in a manner which is dynamically applicable to everything. It's always wise to back out your casters after they've expended their mana so they're not vulnerable to being attacked, so you can make room for the rest of units. It's really, really basic stuff. So my approach to designing the AI is not really to come up with solutions to really, really specific stuff. Because for one, you don't want to demarginalize, or you don't want to marginalize what the player is doing. If the player wants to spam battlecruisers, they're going to spam battlecruisers. And they're probably going to spam battlecruisers even if you hard counter them with hit, scan, scourge. So, because it's something that the player wants to do. So you want the AI to be able to address that with what they're doing originally. Now, part of that, of course, is tech restrictions. When you start off Apex, you don't have access to battlecruisers. In much the same sense that Ricky doesn't have access to his special French units. And then the next mission, you encounter Ricky again. He has some more advanced units. You have some more advanced units. So he scales up. He still is Ricky. He's still very French, still very cheesy. But the way in which I've designed it is you can build whatever you want, and he's going to build what he wants. And you can interact with him in how you choose to do it, while coming to know his personality of expanding everywhere, taking over everything, and stuff like that. And every single option you have is viable. And they're all viable in their own specific way. So this is a very needlepoint design. Because I'm changing all the units and everything else, I can design it in a way in which there's no really strict hard counters. There's stuff like Scourge, but they're not hit scan. They're not insanely powerful. You actually have to micro them. There's no things like Snipe or Feedback. Things that instantly kill everything else just at the push of a button. None of these one glove fits all destroys everything, but none of these super hyper specialized gloves that are only useful for X but utterly useless for Y. So what that means with the AI is you can be more flexible in how the AI chooses to interact with you. This is why I say AI is such a critical part of game design, because especially when you're designing single player stuff, you want to account for the AI when you're building stuff. You're going to want to account for how the AI is going to be using these assets you're giving it, especially when you have special stuff like the AI-only races, like Armageddon, for example. Armageddon's AI only. Now, it's true. I can make all of Armageddon's units insanely strong and have no counters or whatever. But the idea of Armageddon is, it's an AI building these. So I design them very intentionally around how the AI handles units, or really with Brood War, how the AI mishandles units, because the AI is very stupid. So everything is really designed with that in mind. And if you're making a custom campaign, you have the freedom to do that. If you're making your own RTS, you have the freedom to do that. If you want to make the AI have a personality, you have to make the concession that that personality is going to have weaknesses as well. There's going to be things that it can't really deal with. And that's going to come as a result just of the game in itself because of the limitations of what you're working with. Like in StarCraft 2, you're never going to stop Ricky from piling all his shit into 2 lurkers on a ramp. He's just going to fucking do it because that's what the AI does. You give them randomized targets or try to give them randomized targets or something. But there's always going to be some way the player figures out, I can break the fuck out of this. And even if you spend years and years and years designing around it, there's always going to be something that comes up that is going to take the teeth out of what you're doing. So what you want to do is come up with a general solution that makes the AI extremely hard to deal with, you know, in an averaged manner. You know, say for example, you have a mission that's air only. It's all islands. It's easy enough to just make the AI spam Scourge and say, ha! My opponent's going to be a pain in the ass for anyone who plays this map. But that's what it amounts to. It's just a pain in the ass. I would much rather have character. My AI in the first island mission did nothing but spam ravens. And the way it attacked you was by dropping turrets on your islands. And you had all your islands all kind of segregated out from each other. You were using lift buildings a lot on Terran. And the AI would attack you with ravens and drop turrets in your bases. And defense drones. And slowly whittle you down with turrets. Is a completely different kind of opponent than one that just did nothing but spam battlecruisers or Scourge, whatever, and just, you know, it smashes your units out of the air because you as a designer knows the player is going to build nothing but air units for this because it's an island map and people are lazy. So I'm going to punish them immediately off the bat. So there are definitely concessions you have to make. And as a designer, it's your goal to entertain, to provide that engagement and that experience. And part of that comes from the player outsmarting and outwitting their opponents. And as a designer, it's your responsibility to give them the window to express themselves. Blizzard hates this. Blizzard despises this. They hate skill expression with a passion. That's why they remove it out of everything they possibly can, like in World of Warcraft. They've removed as much as they possibly can of skill expression, and they continue to do so through this day because they hate this shit. They hate when somebody figures out a clever way to get around something. People are going to still figure out clever ways to get around something. The developer just comes off as incredibly spiteful by figuring out ways to punish them every single time they get clever. And in some ways, you can think of that as a defense for games like Dark Souls, because Dark Souls is basically, you become clever, the entire game just fucking falls apart at the seams.
Well, so when I was saying that you should try to make the AI more like a living entity as opposed to just a list of commands being executed, I guess what I meant to say was that you should be having it execute commands that make sense for its personality. So I don't want to punish players for being clever, but I do want to reduce obvious abuse cases where you're trivializing the difficulty of the situation. There's like a balance to be, achieved there, where you're not leaving your AI very open to obvious abuses. You're still making it so that they are competitive, and then players have a bunch of different strategies that could result in victory depending on how they are executed, and that's your ideal scenario. Well,
I think that's something every AI developer wants, is that their AI doesn't get, completely dismantled by battlecruisers or carriers.
Yes, and that is the thing is that is a given to us and to maybe a lot of other developers who are trying to work with AI, but it's probably not as much of a given to most of the people who are just playing these games and these campaigns a little bit more on the casual side. And part of the reason why I wanted to go in depth into that topic and the topic of AI in general, is precisely because a lot of people don't think of AI as intrinsically linked to the experience that they are having. They think of it more as something that's tacked on afterwards, and they don't think of it as something that's really intrinsically an important part of the characterization of the world from a narrative perspective. How much trouble you're having with a certain enemy is indicative of their strength, and how much respect you should give them. And that's why trash mobs are obviously not nearly as threatening as a big boss that can beat you, but usually the way that they are engaging the players is not quite the same way that you would think. We think back to the Skeleton King from Diablo. You just mouse one him over and over again, and then he dies eventually. Whereas you compare that to Virgil, which we talked about earlier. It seems like you have to do a lot more interaction to beat Virgil at his own game than you do to beat any Diablo 3 boss. And that's why it's so important to, I think, focus on the idea that AI is more than just something that you fight. It's also something that fights you back. It's a representation, an articulation in a gameplay sense of something that is better linked to a more like abstract concept, like a character in a narrative, or just a representation of a community member, like you were talking about with Ricky. Like it can be a lot more, and should be a lot more, than just the enemy that you mouse one over in fucking ARPG or whatever.
I think the only reason people don't think of AI in that regard is because I've never played a game that hasn't. Because there's so few games that even make the attempt to have an AI. So when your experience is with titles that don't have an AI, then you don't really understand what an AI actually offers to you. So think of all these games like StarCraft 2 with all these hard counters and shit in single player content specifically. And they just basically say you have to do this mission a certain way and all these gimmicks and shit. You wouldn't need to do all these chores and stuff. They wouldn't even need to exist if there was just a basic AI that fought you instead. Then you actually play a game. And then it's actually engaging. And then StarCraft 2 wouldn't be boring as fuck. All the awful writing and stuff aside, you could make StarCraft 2 an RTS campaign. You could. Just don't find excuses to avoid gameplay and focus on gameplay. What drives gameplay in a competitive game? Your interactions with your opponents. And your opponent, in this case, is the computer AI.
And Nekron, you said you were having conversations with people, or you just felt the general vibe of talking with people who fit the bill that I was just describing, right? I think this is a point that you had made earlier in one of our chats where you mentioned that people don't usually think of AI in the same way that we do. People usually think of it as a more like abstract concept or something than just something that you're supposed to interact with.
Well, sure, but that stems from the fact that generally people think that AI is like way more complicated than it actually is. Like,
right. They think of it as a more abstract situation.
Even in Brood War, people expect the AI to somehow be able to execute the script, even though it has half the units disabled, right? Or well, in general, people like below way too hard when it comes to expecting stuff from AI and how much can it actually do compared to the reality of the fact that it's just a script with a limited number of actions it can execute.
Okay. I brought that up because I remember that you brought it up a while ago, and I think that was actually the basis for why you wanted to talk about AI in a more like elevated level of discussion. Because you were mentioning that a lot of people feel like AI is more complicated than it actually is. And I think that probably leads to some element of mystique when it comes to discussing artificial intelligence. I think people put a lot of weight on those words. It's more like alleged intelligence.
Yeah. But what we are actually discussing is not real artificial intelligence, right?
Well, I mean, not in the sense that it's like the learning AI that everybody freaks out about and makes conspiracy theories about. With regards to games, the AI in games is really just whoever you're fighting. It's a personification or the technical elements of what makes up the actions that the game world does to you, as opposed to you doing to the game world.
Sure.
Well,
like even pathing is simple. Think of Dark Souls. How many times did I see units sitting running in place on destructible geometry? Because they don't see geometry. You know how you fix that? The AI is using a pathing mesh. Just like the one in StarCraft 2. And some waypoints, because Dark Souls is 2D. That's why things attack you from like a mile fucking away. That's Z. You add destructible meshes to the pathing mesh when you calculate it, bam! What little pathfinding you have should hopefully not get hooked up on destructible geometry all the time. Like, a lot of this shit is incredibly simple.
Especially in Dark Souls, where you can destroy destructible stuff by just rolling into it or attacking it. You'd think that they would at least do that.
They kind of do in Dark Souls 3, but they still get hooked on shit all the time.
Well, they also fall into their deaths all the time, because, again, 2D.
Yep. So, there's a lot of cases where the AI is attacking you and you're not in range. That's because it's looking at a 2D distance. And StarCraft 2 is a 2D game. It's exactly the same as Dark Souls and Brood War. It's very much the same. What that means is that the pathing and the calculations is all two-dimensional. That's why you can't have units going under bridges and over them, because it's two-dimensional. Makes you wonder why they made StarCraft 2 visually 3D to begin with, because they don't take advantage of it in any shape or fashion. So, when you think about this,
I mean,
actually...
that was obviously just so that they can reuse textures from Diablo 3.
Yeah, I would believe it. It looks like Diablo 3, Jesus.
Yeah, it actually does a little bit, now that I think about it.
Just their neural engine is so bad, it turns what could have been good textures into just vomity puke, like all the grass. Jesus Christ. So it's like there's a lot of problems in these games, especially the ones that I demonstrate, where you might think that it's going to take, potentially weeks to months to figure out a solution for, much less implement it. But a lot of the problems with AI in these titles is literally like 5 minutes or less of work, especially when you have the source. Like, you look at StarCraft 2, from the very get-go, their melee AI is designed in a moronic way. One of the biggest FPS sinks outside of combat is the fact they're recalculating the pathing for all buildings on the entire map, including ones they have not built, all ones they're eligible to build at some stage, every tick. So when we disable that behavior and now fire the build command once through a trigger, the AI builds faster. I gain back 40 FPS baseline. The AI actually performs better. Like, obviously, when you just start getting into AI and just start building stuff in something like Unreal or StarCraft or whatever, it may seem a little overwhelming, but it's very logical. The most of it is very logical. You don't need to worry about stuff like inputs or rating or pathing or any of this other shit. And most of the times when you're working in custom content, because a lot of the times you don't even have access to that shit anyways. But if you did have access to that shit, half of it's incredibly easy to fix. Pathfinding is one of the most complicated things you can get into with AI. But a lot of things that have problems with it, actually fixing that stuff is really easy. Because all the hard work is already done. There's just something really asinine being done some way down the line. Like Dark Souls. Two-dimensional. I'm sure there's some way to call a pitch distance and be like, oh, let's not attack when this guy is 50 feet above me. Or let's not attack when my projectile can't actually hit him. Because that's also a problem with all these games, is shooting at fucking walls. That is an easy thing to fix.
Yeah, well, the AI knows all of these things. It just doesn't have them as part of their conditionals.
Yeah. This information is not expensive to call on. Not at all.
Well, we've been talking for just about an hour and 48 minutes here. And I think we've hit on some pretty important points about AI being manifestations of the game world, ways to articulate it in a gameplay sense, and all that good stuff. I'm going to keep talking if you guys want to, or if you guys have any other points that you'd like to bring up about AI. But I think it's a pretty good opening into the subject anyways.
I mean, the second you start getting into specifics, it's going to take longer to talk about, especially without examples. But obviously, when I was talking about Apex and StarCraft 2, it was an AI-centric project. So, like I said, you make concessions when you're designing an AI. You're just going to have limitations compared to what a person can do. There's always going to be things a person can perform better. There's always things an AI can do better. So my goal is to take advantage of what the AI can do. And obviously, I want to make a difficult project. I was going to make a project where you definitely had to be around master's level to finish the first chapter. So it was going to be about 4 or 5 chapters. In order to finish the first chapter, you were going to have probably around 150 plus APM, which is very high for StarCraft 2. But 150 plus APM may sound like a lot, but it isn't. It's actually pretty low. When you're actually doing stuff and actually focused on the game, you'll hit 100 APM pretty easily. You'll hit 150 APM just keeping your resources low. So when I design this, initially, I do unit tests. I focus things very specifically on individual elements to figure out how each individual element complements. Now, it's true that with Brood War API, you can have perfectly dancing Marines. You can have perfectly kiting Mutalisks. And to an extent, I could replicate this in StarCraft 2. But I didn't feel like that was going to be something that really actually contributed to the gameplay a lot. I wanted the AI to do some micro, but I didn't want the AI to be basically Boxer all the time. Because as an end user, it wasn't going to be fun to play against when the AI always has a perfect dance. But I wanted the AI to be aggressive, to expand and take map control. I wanted the AI to punish you for being content and playing the same way you play in Blizzard. Because Blizzard's campaigns, when you look at it as objectively as possible, you look away from all the disgusting writing and all the other really unpleasant things associated with it. They're unpleasant to play because they are non-interactive. And in the few missions there are expansions, you rarely ever get punished for taking them. The AI doesn't do anything. It's always just non-existent because it's not an AI. So when I wanted to make Apex, it was very simple. None of this micro mission bullshit. You are going to have to be very good at micro, but you're going to be microing in an RTS like you would within a Brood War competitive game. And all this shit is very basic. I was removing active abilities. All these active abilities Blizzard added into Active's chores, those were gone. Macro mechanics, gone. All that shit, gone. And as a result, you focused more on how your units behaved. The actual behaviors of units, their characteristics were most important. Things like collision size were actually a thing now in StarCraft 2, as opposed to everything having the exact same collision, causing them to collide inside of each other and turn into a bulbous mess it's impossible to see. I was changing all that. So things behaved a lot more like Brood War. It was a very, very positive experience. AoE was less insane, stuff like that. And then I wanted the AI to be aggressive. I wanted it to replicate two things. So first was Warlords and Merchants. I played a lot of games in Warlords and Merchants that went on to 2 or 3 hours. I don't fatigue like normal players do. These were long FFA games. And there was many cases I was brought down to like a single command center, and I would come back and win the game against people who own the entire map. I wanted to replicate that kind of behavior in StarCraft, where you could play a long map, and it wasn't a 1v1. There was very, very few 1v1 missions. Actually, I think out of 12 missions in the first chapter, 1 was 1v1, maybe 2. So I wanted to have more scale, which StarCraft 2 can't handle, because StarCraft 2 is a very small-scale game. Its engine is Warcraft 3. It cannot handle large numbers of units. I was trying to stuff large numbers of units down its mouth, and it was crying every step of the way. So that was going to be an issue, but especially with the Zerg. Basically, Zerglings didn't even exist half the time because of how bad they performed in the AI's hands. It was insane. And that was unfortunate and something I hoped would get fixed later on down the line. Of course it didn't, because Blizzard XDDDDDD. But
Find
Todd will be very rich. All the pizza he can buy from Tony, pre-cooked. So the other thing I wanted to replicate was the personalities of professional games. So one of the things that always stuck to me, thinking and watching a lot of Brood War professional play back in the days of Savior and J-Dong and Flash and stuff like that, is personalities and rivalries. I wanted to replicate that in a campaign environment. That's one of the reasons why I was using community names and stuff like that. It's that you could have something to associate with them. Because the campaign got kind of zany later on. And I think having a good grounding that people can relate to when they start off is very important. Because Apex was designed for an extremely niche subset of players, people of an extremely high skill level, or at least a competently high skill level who are able to improve, and people who are associated to that community, I could pull them into that environment by using names I recognized. Then those names would be associated with an AI that behaved at least in a similar function to those players. For example, Ricky spamming Reapers and expanding everywhere. Basically, exactly this. And then we would go from there. And that I would create rivalries. That's where we talk about things like the AI's play style and difficulty and stuff like that. There's going to be weaknesses to these. Weaknesses they might cover up or evolve over time as you go through the campaign. Just like in an actual tournament or a series of tournaments, players may improve or adapt their strategies as time goes on. I wanted these to be abstracted to the player in a way that didn't require dialogue. Apex was going to be cinematic heavy, but cinematics and dialogue like that only took place between maps. Never during the process of a mission would there be an indicator or something that took control of the camera away from the player. That's just bad game design in general. But it also means that the AI's responsibility is to portray everything that would otherwise be portrayed through cinematics. Additionally, in-game dialogue would be doing the job of things like indicators and tooltips. There would be no tooltips, no help pop-ups, nothing like that in the entirety of Apex for anything. Every single element would be introduced through dialogue or through actual engagement. So for example, in the second map, when you play against Ricky, he gets access to units that are not normally within StarCraft 2. In StarCraft 2, a lot of the units that you're seeing are basically reimagined versions of their originals, basically closer to StarCraft 1. But within the second map, you were seeing basically like mercenary units that had also been revamped. So one of them was the cheesed-wheeled Crusader. This was basically a beefed-up Hellion. And they did very, very different things than regular Hellions. There was also the Death Reaper X that Ricky would also spam. These also do different things than Reapers. They're much different than their mercenary counterparts. There is no introduction to these. They just show up and attack you. So, because there's no active abilities and stuff like that, they don't immediately express their power budget in a giant burst and fuck you over because you don't know what's going on. So that means that the interactions that you have with the units is now telling a story. They're telling the story of Ricky's advancements, what Ricky actually uses for his for when he's fighting serious, for when he's really getting down and dirty and stuff like that. And then the map would evolve over time. The AI picks up its aggression, and it changes its attack styling later on. So with the setup I had currently, it was a little difficult to do stuff like change the size of its attacks and what specific units it attacks with, because StarCraft 2's melee AI by default is looking at how many units it has and not what specific units it has. So there is a variable that we added in and associated with that. That's how many units I have to attack, and that can be changed on the fly. So sometimes Zerg especially would spam a lot of small attacks later on, and then as the game went on, they would ramp it up to like 50, 60 units, and then I attack. That could be 50, 60 Infestors, it could be 50, 60 Vipers, Devourers, Guardians, Swarm Hosts, stuff like that. So that made the map initially very aggressive, but then becomes slower and more tactical later on. And the actual compositions were just whatever they had, which was also something that could be changed through the stock and the triggers. So it was a little inflexible in some regards. But the end play experience is that the AI was ultimately, as a whole, much more aggressive than using timed waves. Because basically, once it had these units, it didn't matter what the units were, it was attacking you. And the way that we had restructured the attacks was that normally StarCraft 2's AI, the melee AI, will pull back after it's attacking to defend itself. It doesn't do that in Apex. The only units that were available for defense were those that were waiting to be assembled into an attack force. Basically, the way StarCraft 2 works is it always has an attack wave active. Always. As soon as a unit is made, it's added to the attack wave. What's determining what that attack wave is doing, being defending or attacking, is a galaxy file called like melee attack wave or something like that. And it basically has a whole bunch of different states, either defending or attacking, and then some stuff specifically related to the beacons they added in Legacy of the Void. I disabled all that stuff. And it's going to have my own system if we needed it for the campaign because their implementation was terrible. So we restructured it. Normally in StarCraft 2, the melee AI has the wave. And the wave is wherever, following an invisible captain, just like in Warcraft 3. And when a new unit is added, it gets added to the attack wave, and it just marches across the wave to join the attack wave. Marches across the map. Even if it's like a 256 times 256 map, and it's one Marine joining like 80 Hellions, and he has to run all over the fucking place. That's what he's going to do. It's inefficient, gets units killed pointlessly, looks dumb, makes all AIs behave exactly the same, no matter what. Very, very uninteresting. We got rid of that, called the conga behavior. That's gone. So when a wave enters, there's actually like 5 or 6 different attack waves now internally. There's several of them. Each of them have their own states. So what that means is with some factions like the Zerg, where you could have like a wave contain like 15, 20 units, you could actually end up with like 4 or 5 individual attack waves on different parts of the map doing their own thing. It was kind of uncommon, but it did happen. And it also got rid of the Conga behavior. Basically, it was Brood War. It was Brood War. And all of this was done to unmake the things that Blizzard had done in an effort to make the AI behave more human. Because in trying to make the AI behave more human and more intelligently, they behaved dumber, performed worse. And the things that an AI would normally be very good at, like raw aggression, it failed terribly at. It was basically weaker at things that it could do reasonably well with in Brood War. It was weaker than things it could do in Warcraft 3. And all the existing problems that the AI typically had trouble with were compounded 1,000-fold. Like, Hydralisk Den's not morphing. Spire is not evolving. These set stock commands that would just get ignored. Probably because they timed out in the AI's buffer by the time it refreshed the set stock loop. Because Blizzard just decided that too many people have processor power laying around. Let's burn it. Let's heat up complexes. The power companies are going to pay us if we get these processors running hot and using more power. That's the only excuse I have for Blizzard doing this fucking Galaxy shit the way they've done it. I mean, honestly, the AI shouldn't have been done in Galaxy at all. Galaxy is a goddamn abomination. It is a hideous monstrosity that should be taken out behind the shed, shot with fucking salt, buried, burned, and shipped off to the goddamn core of the sun. It's atrocious. It doesn't do anything that a scripting language should be able to do. It's slower than everything else. And everything that's really critical to the AI is still locked behind hardcode anyways. So if Blizzard had, for example, intended to support custom content, or at least make things easier for their own developers, they would have just had everything hard-coded and then given you the source file for it in like C++ or C or something. It would have been 1,000 times better, 1,000 times more efficient. You wouldn't have to do all this fucking rigmarole shit. But they didn't. So that's why I say you got to make concessions, because every fucking game is going to have problems when you come into the AI. But I think the AI really, what defines AI is the approach that you make. What do you want to make when you make an AI, when you sit down to make it? The reason why most people don't think of AI as anything more than some super complicated, abstract thing that's over there somewhere is because most games make no attempt to have an AI, and the only time the player is actually exposed to AI is usually as a result of it being completely and utterly fucked. Like everything Bethesda's ever made, everything From Software has ever made, everything Blizzard has ever made. When something only exposes itself to fuck shit up because everything else is so hard-coded, so boiled down, so scripted down, so bolted together, that you have a pattern, a series of sequences to recognize, and that's it. And suddenly something else steps in and just slips up as its own asshole. Then you've got a problem. Then you've got a problem.
Is Galaxy really that much worse than Jazz?
Galaxy, superficially, is a butchered version of C that features none of the basic commands like C does, like pointers. And Blizzard doesn't even use fucking arrays. And timers leak. The AI timer fucking leaks. It becomes 33% slower every 10 minutes. And then somebody did a speed test on it when StarCraft 2 first came out, and I believed it was significantly slower than Java.
Amazing.
It's bad.
Well,
so not only is it stripped down, it's also incredibly slow.
The only thing that's worse than a slow programming language is when Nekron falls asleep on his birthday. Wake up!
I'm not asleep.
Wake up, birthday boy. You gotta open your presents. This is Diablo 3 just for you.
No.
Yes!
Honestly, if I got Diablo 3 for my birthday, I would just kill myself immediately.
Well, I know what I'm getting you tomorrow.
I mean, look at Jay Wilson's face. That's the face of a man who is very proud of his chin. He doubled it. And that is a majestic chin. You could lose yourself in there. It's not quite Professor Snape, splitting a battleship in half tier, but he's getting there. He's working on it. He's just got to double it a couple more times.
Yeah, the splitting a battleship with your chin line was for Patrick.
By the way, something else I want to point out about StarCraft 2's amazing AI. Andy Bond, King Arthur from Camelot Systems, is mentioned by name in the notes. This guy, who was once a part of StarCraft Custom Content, who many would say helped founded StarCraft Custom Content, is Blizzard's and has been Blizzard's lead programmer for some time, is mentioned by name within the notes of the Galaxy files for StarCraft's AI, at least it was back in Wings of Liberty beta, and is in some part responsible for that fucking abominable train wreck. And you've really got to wonder, because StarCraft and StarDraft and those other programs are legendary for corrupting everything they touch and fucking everything up and being super unstable. StarCraft is like one of the worst programs in existence, objectively speaking. The only program I've ever even heard of that is comparatively as fucked is CV5. That thing corrupts its own memory on contact, a lot like StarCraft, where mousing over stuff corrupts things and crashes the program at random. XD. And this guy has just been making garbage in Blizzard ever since then. And you would think, him having some kind of association to the AI would have thought back to StarCraft 1 and the custom content surrounding it, because SEAI Edit originated from that site. And instead what you ended up with was this, a shrine to Satan's thorny asshole, just bubbling and boiling and screaming like a choir of spider monkeys. This utter abomination, this banner to madness that is StarCraft 2's AI. The most convoluted, fucked up, inefficient, disgusting, useless, pointless, abominable, unapproachable mess that I've ever seen in my history of dealing with custom content in AI. That every single fucking person I've ever asked about the Melee AI unanimously said they never touched it, they don't want to touch it, and they don't know anyone who's ever wanted to touch it. I looked at one of these alleged AI mods for StarCraft from way back, Green Tea or whatever it was, and all they did was change some numbers around. It performed worse, which was an accomplishment, but it did nothing for it. And basically nobody knows how it works, even though it's really simple. Nobody wants to know how it works because of how awful it is to actually go through and rate. I can think of things that are worse, but I can't think of things in a quote-unquote AAA published game that are worse. And it doesn't surprise me whatsoever that the people making the campaigns for StarCraft 2 didn't want to touch that with a 69-foot pole and rather just spawn everything based on scripts and not give a fuck. Because in the time it would take them to unravel this hideous mess that Andy Bond and whoever else left for them, they can make 50 Heat of the Swarm campaigns. Because Heat of the Swarm is just basically downloading random fucking hype maps off of Google, pissing them through a script, and then throwing in shit about Void and Fel. And that's it. That's StarCraft 2. As opposed to the Galaxy code, which there is no salvation. There's just throwing in a ditch and burning it and forgetting about it.
I had a really salient point, and then I just completely forgot it about halfway through that.
I want to mention that, by the way, StarCraft AI Edit 3 also corrupts everything.
That's what my salient point was. I was going to ask Mesk if he thought that there was anything related to, this guy from Camelot Systems, right? Maybe he's aware of all of the problems and is not going to fix
Gold
them.
Dragon is the one who made SEAI Edit. Yeah. And a very long time ago, I was able to get in contact with him, and I asked him if I could have the source, or at least do some updates to update the help file, because there's so much incorrect stuff in the help file, even back then. And he said, no, you can't do anything. I don't want anyone touching my program, because all these fucking people, all these these first and second generation quote unquote programmers who made this junk for StarCraft, every single one of them is fucking terrified of people finding out how bad they are at programming. They are really, really scared of that. So you won't find source code for anything, and most of them became insanely defensive or outright quit the community the second anybody asked them for source to do anything with it. Even though this guy hadn't been involved with StarCraft for fucking years, clearly was never going to get involved ever again, and all I wanted to do is just update documentation to reflect my modern research, to help people get into it, to help people use his fucking program. And he wouldn't even let me do that. I mean, had I the skills, I would have done it anyways. Because fuck these people. But I didn't have the skills to reverse engineer this shit. Obviously, today, that isn't necessary anymore. Because you have PYAY and all this other stuff. I'm pretty sure that ships with the source code. But back then, these people were fucking scared that people find out that they're actually garbage at what they do.
Yeah, PyAI has its source code, the source code publicly available. And
I just don't get it. Like these programs obviously take some degree of effort to make. And you made the program, because none of these people ever made mods or did fuck all with the programs. They made the programs to help other people get into content. That's great. That's fantastic. So why wouldn't you at least open up the possibility for people to improve this service, help other people get involved, expand the system, expand the software, polish the documentation, and improve what you originally provided as a whole? It just, like, maybe these people are using some, like, illegal libraries or something they ripped off of somewhere, like Blizzard, and they remove all attribution, just like Blizzard does. But even so, who gives a fuck? It's a modding community. Everything you're doing is illegal as fuck anyways. So why hang on to this shit? Especially when you don't have any more association with it at all. It's like map protection. It boggles the mind. It just, like, it just fucking boggles the mind. It's even dumber than map protection because it's not like you can take somebody else's tool, change a name on it, and claim it's yours. Because it's a closed fucking community. People aren't going to be like, oh, wow, you made SCI Edit XD Gold Pro Edition 2000. You're such a talented young man. I've never seen a program like this before. Fuck no. That doesn't happen here. This is dumb, man. So now you have AI Edit, which I've always suspected corrupts something it touches. Because there's so many instances where, like, patches would change stuff and things would behave so fucking differently between patches. But I couldn't see anything going on. I had no idea what was going on whatsoever. And I knew people who were programmers that could have helped, but didn't have access to the source. Couldn't even look at what was going on. It's just, like, when you're looking at a mod or a map in StarCraft, you don't really need to provide the source because you can just open it.
yeah,
You know, you can rip it easily. And map protectors, they can be unprotected. But reverse engineering some of these programs is a huge chunk of time. It can be a real pain in the ass to reverse engineer stuff. And some people are going to casually reverse engineer stuff as a challenge. You have Zentax. Zentax is a community built on reverse engineering. They love going through encryption and stuff, and reverse engineering and ripping things out of games. Not because they're going to resell the assets or put them in stuff, but because a lot of people enjoy the challenge of decryption, of getting through, like, compression and encryption and stuff. A lot of people enjoy the challenge of that. But when you're in a modding community, what would you rather be doing? Investing however many weeks or months into reverse engineering some program because some asshole is too fucking haughty to just give you his fucking source code and help people do shit with it, his own fucking program? Or would you actually rather be working on improving that software at all? Because it's one or the other.
The motivation of people who are actually keeping their stuff under wraps after their departure from the scene is, and always will be, incredibly baffling to me. It's like these people who make maps and then disappear later, and somebody will contact them.
Like I mentioned before, all these fucking protected maps What do you know? Blizzard later down the line decides to release some changes. The first was the return bug because of code injection. That fucked up like 90% of the maps that were on Battle.net. And now the recent patches fucked up some more shit. My map freaking crashes. And I have no idea why. But I can fix it because it's my map. Most of them, you can't unless you reverse engineer it and decrypt it. Now, maybe you'll get lucky in some place like XGM's going to have this shit. But a lot of the niche maps, not a chance. Only people that the map developers hurt is themselves. Now people can't even enjoy their work anymore.
Well, for you to enjoy the work, there has to be work to enjoy. And without AI, there's nothing to enjoy. Just look at Diablo 3.
I do enjoy Diablo 3 because I enjoy your pain.
Okay.
I knew I shouldn't have agreed to this. This is Nekron's way of getting payback after I wished him happy birthday all those times.
Hearing your cries of anguish is what keeps me going.
Same.
Knowing that you're waking up, screaming, drenched in cold sweat, after saying the Boner King in his green glory talk about how you will suffer as he suffered.
Yeah. Why? It's always green.
Yeah,
It
every
is green.
undead in that game is green.
Green or purple, man. It's always green or purple.
The entire fifth act is green from start to finish.
Blizzard went to political college and they said, this is color theory. Purple and green go together. And Madsen was like, huh, purple and green. Everything's gotta be purple and green.
In
So
Heat
now-
of the Storm, you only chose between purple and green in the evolution missions. So.
And then every game to copy off of Blizzard, which is like 90% of them, everything is fucking purple and green. Everything's fucking purple and green. Again, I think the strongest part of Dark Souls is that they're not using fucking Blizzard's brain-dead quote-unquote art quote-unquote style. This brain-dead shit they ripped off of some fucking comic years ago and now make everything fucking green and purple. At least in Dank Souls, it's not all green and purple. Unlike fucking World of Warcraft, where Blizzard is trying to be super stealthy about some of these areas where everything is fucking green and purple. But it's all green and purple, everything. And it's just, there's nothing wrong with the concept in general, but when you use it for everything, you've really have got to wonder, where was Hitler?
Oh, he's in South America. Did you guys hear about that? Apparently, he escaped, and a bunch of other high-ranking Nazis escaped. There's just this a city or village of Germans. It's 100% German, and it's in the middle of South America.
Well,
like
I
in the
Probably
mountains.
reincarnated him. You know, like Jesus, he rose from the grave. Now he is a cyborg. That Hitler is a cyborg?
Yeah.
I don't know. Never heard of it.
Oh, it's like a Bionic Commando? It's an action platformer from the 90s or 80s or something.
The only 90s and 80s games that I know of are some stuff from TurboGrafx 16, maybe.
Wait, maybe that's the real
NES.
solution. Maybe Hitler is the first artificial intelligence in video games.
Maybe he is.
I mean, Nekron said that Tuzor was worse than Hitler, so...
Is he
Well,
wrong?
back when I was writing Tuzor, I had no idea about how any of this works, really.
So are you saying that Tuzor is Hitler, or you are Hitler?
Me.
You.
You.
Sigel. You guys know
That's not legal.
that a guy got charged money? He was actually fined for teaching his dog
Yeah.
how to sig hail. How insane has this world become where you can charge someone for that?
Then he raised $100,000 on the line or something.
Oh, did he? So he actually
Yeah,
came out of that on top.
Yeah.
Yeah, he didn't pay his fine. He just sent the equivalent amount of money that he was being fined. It was like £800 or something. He sent that to a charity instead.
Well, and then he made like $100,000 on top of it. Man, this is systematic. We lose our rights, and someone else gets rich off of it.
Yeah, he's
shit, man.
allegedly he raised that money for legal battles, but we'll see.
You know, there's probably people out there who think putting AI in a game is bad because it makes casuals have to think, and that would be considered racist against the unintelligent. There's already people who think that skill expression is a bad thing in the game, and people shouldn't be able to. I think it was called like filleting, skill filleting, or something like that. There was some probably article about that, but some people actually believe that you shouldn't have skill expression in games, and that's probably why Blizzard is removing it from their games as much as possible. Is because you know, someone might post on Tumblr that they were dehumanized because somebody else outplayed them.
Well, didn't you? Was it you who sent that one Reddit comment or forum comment from some World of Warcraft discussion?
Here, I'll find that for you so you can put it on your stream. Hold on. Here.
This is some guy who was like, well, there's no such thing as good or bad players, just different play styles.
Yeah, and then like there was some, because this was like a response for some guy, because basically they made everybody able to get legendaries. And before, legendaries required at least like some effort to get, at least like on farming and stuff on behalf of the guild that you were in, because you had to get the items and you had to get the materials to create it, like Thunder Fury and Hand of Rag and stuff like that. Now everybody gets them. It's just all RNG. And, you know, people who had played back then is like, well, now everybody gets legendaries. They're not special anymore. Every average Joe can get legendaries. And he got downvoted to fuck because the casuals got mad. And then some other guy was like, everybody is an average Joe. There is no better skilled players, just different play styles. I mean, even in a game as casual as World of Warcraft, that is very, very far from the case.
Well, I don't know, man. Maybe I'm going to say the liberal this time, since you didn't say it yet. That just sounds like liberalism to me.
It does. The amazing thing I love about liberals is by segregating people like this, they actually create the divides that they claim to be trying to resolve.
Well, from Hitler to the AI to liberals in less than 5 minutes.
I mean, it's Hitler was probably a liberal. He was trying to be progressive.
That should be the title of this podcast, actually.
No, the title of the podcast is You, Dummy.
Oh, okay.
So.
Hold on, I'm fucking looking. Hold your goddamn fucking pants on. God fucking damn it, where is this shit? When I have like 800,000 files per desktop, I can't find anything except for this. Since we were talking about Hitler, we can't go without this.
Yeah, isn't there like an Indian company called Hitler or something?
Yep.
That's really amazing. We've turned ourselves into a lifestyle podcast now. We're just going to talk about the latest news.
I found it, boys. Here you are, guys. You have found it. Literally double chin, rock bottom into China. Blizzard's community in a nutshell.
We are all average Joes. There are no superior players, just different playing styles.
Yep. And that's why everything is a QTE. Because people, and I'd say people as loosely as possible. Because like I said, I don't consider these people because they don't think. They are averse to thinking. They're adverse to improvement. They're adverse to engaging content. People think they shouldn't have to do anything to be recognized as being a gamer, as completing difficult content, That's why difficulty has become a meme. Why difficulty doesn't even exist in games anymore. And what few people who do crave difficulty go to titles that are just fucked up, like Dark Souls. Because, well, at least this game punishes me for doing something stupid. You know, they get desperate. And, well, that's where the money is, you know? That's where the money is. So
well, I think
we're going.
It's an interesting side topic that we'll probably have to save for another day to discuss in full, but the idea that, like, how would I phrase this so that I don't get Jaberino'd? There's like a way where you look at people who are... and then I just see DF talking about Hitler in India. I'm sorry. So if you look at people in their average daily lives, most people have these like full-time jobs or they go to school or something, and they don't have a lot of time to dedicate to video games as like they do see them as toys, right? Like we talked about that for a whole podcast, games as toys. And you have people who are going to see them as toys and say like, hey, this is my relaxation. And, you know, those people don't want to put in the effort to be, constantly excelling and improving at something that is effectively just a toy, using a toy. Those are the people who aren't going to be playing really heavily competitive games or...
You know, you say that, but then you've got the average phone game, like fucking Puzzle and Dragons, where it's like, not only do you have to sink an insane amount of time into it, you have to be super conscious about what's going on. Because what actually happens is, this is why shmups and stuff are super popular, despite the fact, low income, very busy, not much time to put into casual games and stuff like that. The game playtime is very short. Things happen very fast, but all of that, skill expression and stuff like that is bundled into that short amount of time.
Yeah, well, games like that are probably, I mean, just by virtue of being phone games, they're a lot more accessible. They're a lot more convenient. So it's not like, that's something that you could do on your break at your shift job, It's not something that you're going to be necessarily... Maybe you are investing a lot of time into it on your off hours, when you get home or over the weekend or something. But for most people, at least as I've seen it and as I've discussed it with people, their gaming is more of a leisure activity than it is something that they want to invest a lot of time in with the idea of, improving on. And I personally think that you should try to take every action that you do in your life and do it well and just seek to improve at that. And it's really hard to do something like that, but I think it's the only way that your actions can have meaning is if you invest in them. And I also believe that we talked about this in the Elitism podcast, where if you're not actually fully enjoying your time, you're not fully investing into your time, then you should be investing in your time into another action, because that action isn't doing it for you. And it all comes down to, I guess, the individual's like personality or whatever, but a lot of people will not like putting their all into every action they do. It is very challenging to do that. So a lot of people see these games as more leisure activities, so they don't judge them with the same sort of standards as they do, say, movies or TV shows or something. And even then, a lot of people have very varying standards.
Well, Transformers and Star Wars were successful, so standards obviously don't exist. I think of it like, okay, so how many people do you know read books? Probably at least some, or at least have heard of them. But what is a book? A book is a colossal, tremendous amount of information. The average book takes quite a bit to get into, quite a bit to keep track of. Think of, for example, Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings. Lots of different characters, lots of stuff going on. There's engagement. There's some engagement going on. You can choose to read it in bursts. You can choose to read it over time. Something you do in your leisure. Lots of people read books. A game is no different. It's interaction. It's reading. It's engaging. It's absorbing information and processing information. The problem with a lot of these quote-unquote games that come out today is there is actually no interaction whatsoever. You are exchanging one chore, which is your working life, for another chore, Diablo 3 and StarCraft 2. There's a significant difference between playing a game, especially for leisure, and then performing a series of actions you have been tricked into thinking is a game, when it's really just another chore. Americans have a hard time telling them apart because, again, They think of things more as toys. They don't think that anything should be engaging. But it's really it's really a result of them just being whipped, of them being psychologically manipulated by marketing into thinking that they're playing something when they're really not. Look no further than things like time gating. Time gating is very much an enemy of expression and very much an enemy of leisure. Time gating is used to force you to either spend money on stuff or whatever. And of course, the really obvious layman's level of that is you go into these phone games, you actually really enjoy playing them, you want to get more into it, but they have limited play time and you have to pay more to play more. So people will invest like $1, $4, $5, and before you know it, you've racked in $800 trying to get a waifu out of a loot box. And that's the route you go. And that's the route all these quote-unquote games go. With StarCraft 2, to me, when I think about gaming software, there is no question in my mind about the kind of people who play it. And that is people who don't like playing games, but want to identify as gamers. And I don't think that your lifestyle has anything to do with it whatsoever. Because I think that the vast majority of people who have limited time, especially myself in present day, I find myself doing a lot of yard work, a lot of housework, just a lot of upkeep and stuff in general. When I have a little bit of free time to myself, I want to spend it meaningfully. I think that people who have restricted time are going to think the same way. They're going to think, I have this alone time to myself. I want to spend it in a way that's really going to make the most of it. And maybe that isn't putting their 100% into something, but it's something that can at least distract them, take them away from, you know, the atrocities that they're forced to commit with at their desk job, their boss, and their wife's boyfriend.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a form of deriving meaning from your action, though. You're realizing that you need to take a break and power off for a moment and stop outputting so that and do some inputting, or the other way around, rather.
But at the same time, when you interact with these mediums, you're not interacting with anything, and it's very, very vapid. That's why the vast majority of people will never finish most of these games, why a lot of these people own games just to own them, stuff like that. You enter this period where the medium is not actually interacting with you, and the experience as a result is very hollow. And then you start coming up with excuses to justify the time and the purchase to yourself. And then you're dishonest to yourself. So, speaking from a design perspective, when I design stuff, obviously I'm designing for a niche audience. And I think that's the way all software should be done, because that means you can excel in what your original intent is. And when I design software, I expect your full attention. I expect you to come in wanting to be engaged as a player, which is to say it will be difficult. There will be no I win easy mode button. There will be no difficulty sliders. There will just be the experience I set out to make. And that experience will not make an attempt to be art, because games are not art. So we're going to avoid all the unpleasant connotations of I'm a person playing in my leisure and I'm expected to somehow understand this deep meaning message. No. People play games because they want to be engaged, they want to be distracted from things, they want to have something to express themselves in on their own, in the comfort of their bathroom stall or their house or their outhouse or wherever behind the shed in their execution grounds. They want to have something that they can tunnel into for a time. And what games offer today is distractions. You know, that's basically it, and it's not meaningful. So once people realize, they come to the realization that what they're playing is just a distraction, then the value of all this alleged entertainment immediately dissolves, and there's nothing left for them. There's lots of people like that. Lots of people who open their eyes and realize, holy shit, this is actually really not that interesting. I've just been suckered into something. No. Marketing has made me believe I'm a part of something I'm not actually a part of. And I'm not actually really enjoying this. Like League of Legends, I think, is a really great example for this, because League of Legends in its standalone, as a concept, isn't necessarily a bad game. But everything surrounding it, from the time gating to the community to the balancing and stuff like that, is toxic. And as a result, individuals who play it both casually and seriously ultimately become very frustrated. I don't know anybody who hasn't become frustrated by extent of being exposed to that game. And most of the people that I played with were casuals.
I can relate to the part about like realizing that ultimately playing, well, quote unquote, playing some games is just a waste of time. Because I don't really feel engaged by them in any way, or I don't feel that I can even spend time in a worthwhile way while playing them.
See, a lot of...
But
Go ahead.
when it comes to League of Legends, for me personally, I don't think I've ever became frustrated with that game, and that's because I was pretty much always playing it for like the... Well, I was just spending time with my friends, honestly, rather than playing it for the sake of playing it. So it was like a social experience more than playing the game for me. Well, we are playing the game together, right? And we were talking about the game, but we're also talking about what we did in our day and whatnot. So it was not really like tiring, even if the game was dragging on or frustrating when it comes to the actual gameplay elements.
Almost all the people I knew that I used to play with, be it League or Warcraft 3 or Heroes, they've all moved on. They no longer play games. And I've seen this excuse come out so many times where people say, I think I've outgrown games. I no longer really enjoy them anymore. But what's really happened is they've just realized that they're playing a distraction. They're not playing a game. And there's nothing out there that is really asking for them to play stuff. And a lot of these people end up playing stuff like MTG or tabletop like Dungeons and Dragons because those mediums facilitate real engagement. And especially D&D. There's so many things of it, and it scales to your engagement. It's a super, super open, super flexible system. And a lot of people end up going to do that, and that's all they play. They never play anything digital anymore because they have come to just loathe even the concept of playing video games because they have been exposed to so much drivel. They have just come to associate the entire platform with drivel. That this is how it has to be because everything is like it. Even though there are plenty of games that are not really that bad, they lose the will to even try to find them, to even play them anymore. And people who have been brought up under the misconception that it's wrong to critic things will instead find flaws and realize these things, but dial back on themselves and say, this isn't a flaw. Or they'll come up with some excuse for it. And then they force themselves to do it. And they end up just getting more and more and more and more better. And they'll never openly admit it because it would bring into question their decisions. They don't want to be viewed in a bad light. But a lot of these people who play this drivel and force themselves to go through this do internally realize that they've just been had. They've just been had. And you'll find that a lot of people, especially in like streaming and video making and stuff like that, they don't enjoy what they're doing whatsoever. But they're getting paid to be a color commentary and they force themselves to do it. And they end up getting really salty. Especially people who play like League and stuff. They get really, really, really salty. Like when I watch, I was watching League Championships when I was still playing. And I just couldn't get over like the expressions of people. Very few people ever actually seem to be enjoying themselves. Now, obviously, they've been playing League for hours every single day and practicing and stuff like that. But it never came off to me for a second that it seemed like they were actually genuinely enjoying what they were doing. People smiled when they won, but that's because they won a shit ton of money and it's finally over for now. But for most people, you could just tell by the looks on their faces. You can tell by their body language. There's a difference between like the social anxiety that a lot of them definitely have, being in a stadium, but just in general, like the entire situation is antagonizing, and it's supposed to be people having fun. They're supposed to be playing a game. A game is supposed to be about having fun. And there's lots of instances like that. Most of the people I talk with are casuals. I don't talk to too many people who I would say are not a casual. And all of them get pissed off. Every single one of them get pissed off. and very few of them have anything actually really like objectively tangible to say is good about X or Y title they played. Like HKS was forcing himself to slog through fucking Dawn of War 2 Retribution and Dawn of War 3, and the only thing he had to say positive about any of those games was that Dawn of War 3 is kind of like an RTS, and that was it.
Yeah, that would be my experience with Dawn of War 3 as well. Kind of an RTS.
And it's like, it's just so forgettable. Like every single one of these games is just completely forgettable. And that isn't to say that you need to like stand out and make a huge splash and make a big statement. Just look back to how games used to be, at least for stuff like Japan, where people tried to make a game. And you can be a casual who works like 9 to 5 and have like 1 to 2 hours to play, and you can still enjoy R-Type 3. You can still enjoy Castlevania because people did. They were engaging games, they endured, they were successful, and they aged really, really well to modern day. There's nothing saying today that games can't be at least that good, just that developers and marketers have realized, hey, we don't even need to make games anymore because apologists will buy up shit. They will buy up literal shit and slather themselves in it to identify as people who play games. That's like the heart of the issue, is that the culture has mutated to be all-inclusive of people who aren't gamers. And surprise, surprise, people who were gamers start to think, you know, something is wrong. I don't enjoy games anymore, and they stop playing games. And what you're left with is just horseshit and a few occasional fuckwits like me who still stick around hoping that one day something will come out that isn't a heaping pile of shit.
As far as League of Legends goes, my experience of the game is that as the game became way more focused on team play and way less focused on individual success, playing solo competitively became just a waste of time. And even if you won, you did not feel good about the gameplay, the game that you were playing, due to the fact that the game itself was basically where the toxicity of the community actually came from. So, you know, you're looking at a situation where not only does one game matter more to certain players depending on whether or not they're in a promotional series and ranked, but you also have I got to very high diamond in season, I want to say 5 or season 6, and at that point the game had already gotten to the point where if I didn't feed as a jungleman, if I didn't feed my lanes enough, there was nothing I personally could do to actually win the game. And so I had to, you know, basically stack the deck with certain champions that otherwise I would have, you know, far preferred playing Lee Sin every game and carrying with mechanical skill, but that was no longer a strategy, or, you know, it was just not something that you could do to the extent that I wanted to do it. So the game play style had also shifted due to balance changes, but Nekron, what you were talking about where you didn't ever feel frustrated at the game, it seems like you mostly played it with a group of friends as opposed to playing it for the sake of, again, like you said, playing it for the sake of playing the game. And at that point,
I'm not really playing competitively, I don't think.
Right. So at that point, you're talking about a situation where you're not.
That's why people play WoW.
Yeah, you're not really playing to play. It's you're playing as an excuse to have social interaction, which is a very strange. Like, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it is a weird situation where suddenly the ways that you would normally critique games no longer seem to be as important, because that's the reason why you're opting into the experience actually has nothing to do with the game itself. The only thing that is related to the game is the fact that you all play it, and that, therein the significance of the game itself actually is not important at all.
And then I see it tear apart friendships in the process. Seen that and been through that too. So it's like I make this observation a lot with World of Warcraft. Is a lot of people play this game just because it's basically a glorified chat room. That's really all they play it for, and most of them hate it. They may not openly say they hate it, but they hate it. But it's a chat room, and Tom play. It's like why people still use Facebook. I keep asking people why they use this fucking service that openly sells their information and is under fucking gunfire everywhere for basically just turning you into their money, and all your shit is getting data mined, and it's a massive security threat everywhere, and nobody even fucking cares about that. Well, because my friend uses it, so I've got to use it. You've got this communal total disregard for your own fucking safety and your financial security just because someone else uses it.
Well, it's an obligation to use Facebook nowadays. For me, in college, for example, I actually have to use Facebook because if I didn't use it, I couldn't obtain information when I have exams or how to like.
Any
Use a
business that
different
takes
website.
Facebook seriously should be just dissolved.
Basically, more than half information regarding my college classes was located on Facebook.
Jesus Christ. What a goddamn disaster.
Yeah,
But
well,
yeah,
that's the other thing is that now Google runs all the classrooms too. So any digital classroom is usually on it's either on Facebook or it's on Google.
Ugh.
Like there's a literally thing called Google Classroom, I think, where you
What
upload
a
your files
goddamn
that way.
disaster your fucking country is in. Holy shit. In Europe, they're trying to enforce copyright laws. In America, they're trying to get you even deeper into the whole. Holy shit, man. There's such a huge polarity going on. But anyways, I may as well wrap this up because I got stuff I got to do. But why does this relate to AI? Why does game toxicity and distraction and stuff relate to AI? Because, you know, if you're going to play a game, if you're going to read a book, if you're going to do anything, even as a leisure, if you're not just sitting there picking your dick watching like wasps try to break into your house like I do half the day, then you obviously want to do something. You know, you want to do something. And you can casually play a game and still be really good at it. Chess, for example. Some people casually play chess, very good at it. Chess is, again, in regards to thinking. It's competitive. It's not too much unlike StarCraft. There's no reason that a product should be lower quality than something released 20, 30 years ago just because the culture today doesn't like quality in their games. When I talk about things from an objective standpoint, from a developer standpoint, or from a player standpoint, I always come from the same thing. I don't give two fucks about how financially successful a given strategy is. I don't give two fucks about what a marketer is going to say about we should only develop X or Y because Z doesn't have any value in today's market. Z would be computer AI in this case. You don't make money off of making computer AI. That's why no game has it. If you made a game today that promoted having intelligent enemies, it wouldn't be any more financially successful than a game who didn't, because the market doesn't give a fuck about engaging games. Because you have created a market that doesn't care about quality in titles, it doesn't care about experience. So you want to go to the niche. So when I look at this stuff, I look at, you know, when reviewing, I say, this is a product compared to similar products, compared to older products. This is what they should have done. This is what they have done. This is what they could have done. This is what they may do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You review objectively, you break things down. When I look at things from a developer standpoint, I have a mixed audience. A lot of my audience works. A lot of my audience doesn't really have a lot of time. It's hard to even get D&D games going. It's hard for us to even find a free day where everybody's schedules line up. And that's the case for everybody I know who plays D&D. But people want to do it. It's their leisure time. They're going to sit down, they're going to go in your game, and they're going to play, and they're going to spend 5 or 6 hours role-playing a drunk dwarf or somebody in a spaceship or something like that, and they're getting engaged. And that's their leisure. You know, they make supper partway through, they drink coffee partway through. This is their off time out of either being an this is like one of the people is an archaeologist. He has to drive halfway across a frigging like country to get back and forth in his work. And he commonly gets snowed in, and he's always busy. And every free time he gets, he plays tabletop, either online or offline. And tabletop is far more engaging and far more in-depth than something like Diablo 3, where you literally don't even have to be looking at the screen, and you just push one button and the entire game plays itself. And this individual, I would describe him as casual. He is most certainly a casual, an individual that just does stuff in his leisure, not really super heavily engaged in it, but what he is engaged in, he wants to be engaged in. He wants to be driven in, because he keeps coming back. The campaigns can last for years. You can be playing the same game with the same people for years and years and years. It can be a social thing, for sure, but we don't really discuss. We don't really talk outside of the game. He's a person who's been a part of CC forever. I don't even really know him. I don't even really know him at all. I've played D&D with him for almost 2 years. I still don't really know that much about him. I don't really know too much about Mucky. You know, the other 2 players, I know a fair bit about. But 2 of the players don't really know anything about. But we come down, we sit down, and we play D&D. We're playing it for the game. We're playing it for the experience. When I sat down with League of Legends, I'm doing like what Nekron was doing. I only play with the people I know, but I'm still actively engaged in the software. And I can look past some things, like the game being imbalanced or frustrating because of that communal behavior, because you're with players. And because I'm just sitting there watching Zilla get fucking drunk and high all the time. And that, to me, is where the entertainment comes from. But it still gets frustrating when you play a 15-minute game, one person is slightly out of position, they get caught by an 80,000-second CC, and that's it. There goes your 15-minute investment. And for Diablo 3, you get the same experience. You farm and farm and farm and farm, and you finally get the item you get to drop there and make your numbers just 1 or 2 digits higher, but then there was a bad roll on the item, and now you got to farm again. It's not experiences. There's so many different ways of comparing the same kind of concepts. But the end of the concept is that as a designer, as a player, I'm looking at things that actually want me as a player to engage with something. And in a single player game, that requires computer AI. And it can be a difficult game. It can be, R-Type 3. It can be Dodom patching. It can be something that really requires me to actually pay attention. But the thing is, people enjoy expression. Even in their leisure, people enjoy expression. You have something called player feedback. Player feedback is where a lot of different things come from. Player feedback includes stuff like the screen shaking in God of War when you hit enemies. That's feedback for you impacting enemy. Player feedback is intrinsic with something called satisfaction. And satisfaction is the concept of you feeling satisfied that something happened. That something doesn't necessarily have to be something you did, but it's usually closely related. People want entertainment to be satisfying. They want to read a good book, watch a good movie, or play a good game. They may not abstract it that way, they may not think of it that way, but ultimately, satisfaction comes from the result of feeling that something was made in the right, it was a good decision, and there was some kind of reward out of it. For older games, reward was performing well, reaching highest score, seeing tangible improvements from your previous experiences with that game. Americans only wanted to see the end of the game. That, to them, was their accomplishment. So games became less about being difficult and bettering yourself and having tiers, like shmups, and more about just getting to the end. Just seeing the end game screen. And as the years went on, expression became less and less valuable. But still somewhere along the lines, people wanted to be able to express themselves. They just didn't want to do so in a way that costed them time and energy. Ergo, QuickTime events as opposed to computer AI. So if you are a developer who is interested in the concept of computer AI and learning about computer AI and wants to perhaps create a project that benefits from computer AI, you have to think much differently than the average player and the average game developer is thinking right now. Because there is a whole lot of not thinking going on in this industry. And it shows as plain as day to anybody who opens their eyes and actually plays a game like StarCraft 2 or Diablo 3. There is no thinking. No thinking on behalf of the player or on behalf of the game. There's no connections being made. And one of the reasons why social experiences drive things like World of Warcraft and League of Legends is because playing with your friends and engaging with them and doing things with them brings about the satisfaction that those games typically do not provide.
I think that player feedback is a really big, it's definitely thoroughly entrenched in the conversation about AI, because obviously AI is about interacting, and when you are finished with an action, you're supposed to get some sort of feedback for doing that action. So when you have any interaction in your game at all, besides being a step up from a lot of games, it means that you're going to have a response to, like, the player's going to feel a certain way about the interaction that they just had. So I think that looking at it from a perspective of what is enjoyable for yourself, which also plays into the idea that you're developing for a niche, is going to be the most useful way for developers in the modern environment to make content, because then they're not beholden to some ethereal other audience. Then they can start to interpret feedback that they get from other people through the lens of, does this make sense for the purpose of designing something that I enjoy? And, you know, they can dispense with feedback that doesn't match up with that. And now they have something to basically grade their project against. You know, they have an intent that isn't impossible for them to judge. And the idea that you're designing a product to sell, like most game developers, assuming they are in bed with some sort of publisher, you know, they're trying to create a project or a product rather that is going to sell on the market. And so they won't know how well it's going to sell, obviously marketing notwithstanding and focus grouping notwithstanding. They're not going to know what's going to sell unless they can look at past trends or whatever, and also until they actually release their product to the market. Whereas if you're dealing with developing for a niche and developing for yourself, you know if you're satisfied with a certain product before you release it to anybody else. Before anybody else lays an eye on it, you know whether or not it's satisfactory. I think judging things based on that is really helpful. At least it has been for me. And the few times where I betrayed that premise and kowtowed to other people's feedback, I never was able to respect the product at the same level at that point, and wasn't personally satisfied with it anymore. So that's all I have to add to what you were talking about. I just, you know, reaffirming it and adding on the idea that you should be developing for yourself, for a niche that you agree with, for you and your friends to enjoy that experience, because there's no way that you're actually going to... It's very, very difficult to design a game that's going to, like, as a conventional product, that's going to succeed on anything it sets out to do, besides maybe make some money. As an experience itself, I don't think it's going to be a particularly worthwhile endeavor.
I really highly recommend anybody who really wants to see some of this in action, look up the developer Cave. Cave is a Japanese developer that creates shmups. They develop for a niche audience. And from what I have heard, a lot of the times Cave can't actually beat the games they make. But they understand their audience very well. And they understand the games very well. And I don't think Cave has ever released a game, at least within semi-recent times, that is really bad. Cave has actually rather released a lot of very good games. And these games are very exclusive. You try to jump into something like Donpachi or whatever, like I'm going to at some point. I'm going to show you how bad this is for someone like me. You try to jump in one of these games. You're going to get destroyed. You're going to get obliterated. It's going to be a lot different than even playing one of these StarCraft campaigns that claims to be difficult, like Apex. Apex gives you, or was going to give you, access, no matter what your skill level, into scaling upwards and learning. A lot of these shmups, even on the easiest difficulties, are extraordinarily difficult, especially for someone who has never played the franchises before. So they're inaccessible. And liberals would complain about inaccessibility. They're under the obsession that something must be applicable to everybody, that something must be for everyone. But this is what creates bad software. This is why everything turns out objectively shit. Because when you try to cater to everyone, you're going to end up catering to no one. You can't find that middle ground because it doesn't exist. There are too many polarities. So from the business perspective, it's always best to play safe. And safety is in reliability. When you create something that isn't a game, but allows people to identify as a gamer and feel the satisfaction of being a gamer without actually being a gamer, you hit a sweet spot in which you access people who are not gamers. That's the vast majority of the industry. If you create something that has a skill curve to it that requires learning and improving and investment, you are going to hit a market, But that market is going to be very small, and you have to be able to actually access that market. And accessing a market can be just as difficult as finding the market to begin with, if not more so. There's actually a lot of games that have failed that were otherwise decent just because they released too close to another release that consumed all the media presence. So that's all I'm going to add on that, because I could honestly talk about this shit for hours, and most of it's just rambling like everything else. And I've got stuff I've got to do. So I will leave it at that. Most of the stuff I talk about this comes into my reviews, so if you're really interested, you can always hunt those down, but you can always expand on some of the more subjects later on. And yeah, AI is really intrinsic to all that because experience is defined by AI. AI is driving the experience. So when you think about it that way, everything will make sense, and you can probably look at some game mechanics a little more clearly.
Nekron, what do you think of liberals?
That's a question I wasn't expecting.
And by that I mean, Nekron, what do you think of AI?
Is the AI liberal now?
Is it?
Listen, just give me your final thoughts on the topic so we can wrap this baby up. We've been 3 hours.
Yeah. Well, I remember thinking that the last thing I wanted to say, somewhere down Mesk's last, well, it's not really a rant. Well, some time ago anyway, I wanted to say, in regards to Diablo 3, then what's satisfying in it? You said that you're like looking for unique items and it's dissatisfying when they have wrong stats roll on them. But I honestly don't even think that, even if the perfect item drops for you, I don't really consider it satisfying in Diablo 3.
You won the RNG lottery! Woohoo!
I honestly, without a doubt, fuck. Without a shadow of a doubt in my mind, I can say that hitting an enemy in Diablo 1 and not missing them is more satisfying to me than finding the perfect unique item in Diablo 3 for my build.
Because finding random items, there's nothing engaging about that whatsoever. It's like you're just pushing the idiot button, and it's just, congratulations, you're an idiot. And then there's an RNG number generator behind it, and it's just, well, you rolled a 1 instead of a 2. Congratulations. Like, there's no actual satisfaction to come from that because you didn't fucking do anything.
There's also no lasting impact in Diablo 3. Like, everything you do is permanent pretty much.
What do you
every
mean?
Every choice you make is permanent. You can change it on a whim.
Oh, it's impermanent. Permanent means forever.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so you can reskill everything in between battles and stuff, which can be used to add gameplay, but isn't in Diablo 3.
Yeah.
And also obviously has the added detraction of removing any weight to the decisions that you make, because you could just change them 5 seconds later.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing for me. That's just, well, if you can change everything on a whim, it doesn't really matter what you do, right?
Yeah.
Or it matters less.
Well, I mean, like, if a corollary in any of the other Diablo games is that if you carry around like a different set of weapons or armor or something for specific encounters, it's like, oh, I'm gonna swap out of my gear. Like, that's something that you can swap out instantly. But they made everything in Diablo 3 work that way, where you can just swap stuff out in the middle of combat or whatever. And it obviously, I think in addition to simplifying the amount of choices you had to make to begin with, it made it so that it was a very binary situation as far as like gameplay is actually concerned, and you know, making some sort of identity, carving out some sort of identity for yourself as a person who's playing this class.
Not to speak of, the only choices you make is what color stuff is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now the Mass Effect 3 ending is the entire game.
God, I can't believe that was a thing. Someone thought it was good too. Shit.
Well, I think with that, it's time to say happy birthday to Nekron.
Happy birthday, Nekron!
No.
You're the sweet, joyous, luscious age of 69. Haha, yeah! Oi, psycho, Indian, hui, what up?
You.